We begin world discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
Oh, not much. How are you?
Oh, it's been a heck of a day.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Just one of those high intensity. I was doing really try hard practice and then giving commentary and stuff, and people had lots of exciting questions and things like that. So it's very full on. How are you?
Yeah, comfortable anyway. Been pretty busy lately doing proofreading and other things, preparatory stuff, podcast stuff. So, yeah, it's kind of been a full plate.
Mm-hmm.
At least as full as the plate of a lazy person gets anyway.
Well, plates are different sizes.
Well, they are at that.
So we didn't do a session last week,
Mm-hmm.
but the big obvious thing that people are going to ask about, and I'm kind of curious about as well, is the Mueller report and then Article 13, Article 17 stuff. Those are the big ones.
Yeah. I don't have a whole lot to add on either of those as far in terms of what I've already said before. I mean, I think, for one, as has been pointed out many times online, we don't have the full report. The full report has not been, quote unquote, publicly disclosed. I don't really think that if and hypothetically when it's publicly disclosed, since I think the Attorney General announced that he would release it, albeit with some parts redacted to the public. But I don't think when it gets released that there's going to be anything just new. I don't think there's going to be anything that's really going to indict President Trump. You know, I don't think people will anymore want to impeach him after it's publicly released than they already do. So if you like him, your mind isn't going to be changed by the report, and if you don't like him, then you're still not going to like him afterwards. So I don't really think it's that meaningful in that sense. And I don't think it's likely impeachment is going to result from it. There might be some charges brought related to some of the other investigations. Some of the stuff in the report might be relevant to some of those other investigations at the state level. We've talked a little bit about those before. But the report itself is not going to be the end of the administration. So if that's what people were hoping for, they're probably going to be disappointed. But yeah, that's pretty much what what I've been pretty much arguing for since we started. I think people were asking about it 2 years ago when we started up this, and my opinion then was basically that they might find some little things, but they're probably not going to find any smoking gun or anything particularly incriminating. So I think pretty much if what we've heard so far from the report is accurate, as far as what's actually in the report, that seems to be the case. It seems like it's not going to be a big dramatic sea change or bombshell in U.S. politics. So I don't predict much coming of that. Making the report public, that could be an issue unto itself. And again, there's going to be probably some things in the report that people will point to and say, hey, that's doesn't reflect well on the president, or this, whatever. They can make their own judgments on that. But I think there will be some argumentation that there will be some things that maybe are not explicitly illegal, but that break with norms or otherwise indicative of poor character that could be grounds for impeachment. So I suspect that's going to be more the direction things go. But I think that's going to be more just politics as usual rather than a big dramatic moment, so to speak. I don't think, again, that there's going to be enough ammo there for any real push for impeachment.
Well, to break it down a little bit, then you're talking about a distinction between Mueller having charges specifically of people breaking laws as opposed to bad behavior that could pass as impeachment, but that's not his choice to make. So he wouldn't go to them with a big stack of paperwork and say, I think he should be impeached. That's not really his job. His job is to check to see if any laws have been broken and report all of those. And then it's up to Congress, legislature, to basically break everything down, interpret it, and then decide what they're going to gather from that information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not even clear that the Attorney General or that Mueller himself could recommend charges against the president, because the legality of doing that is kind of iffy. It's not really clear if you can really do that. So even that is a bit ambiguous. So, I mean, if there was an impeachable offense found, I suspect that it would not necessarily be brought up in the report. Well, it probably would be brought up in the report, but I think that it would not be sold to the public. They would, Mueller himself would probably go directly to Congress and discuss with them. So I suspect that would be more the route taken rather than coming out and recommending charges. But I don't know that even that has happened. I mean, maybe it's happening and we're not seeing it, but my impression is that there's not any substantive evidence in the report as it stands right now that would suggest that there's grounds for impeachment, or at least clear-cut grounds for impeachment. So that being the case, whether or not there's enough evidence there against Trump to do anything, to make some kind of, something less than impeachment, maybe chastise him in some official resolution or something, or what have you. Even doing that would come down to basically just the votes, who supports him and who doesn't in Congress. And I don't think there's enough votes against to make something like that pass. Certainly not impeachment if people wanted to go that far. So I suspect that the net impact on U.S. politics is going to be just neutral, basically. It's not going to have a substantive impact one way or the other.
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me here is that because this investigation has taken so long, we're already creeping up on the next election cycle here. So
yeah,
it's less likely to maybe snowball into some impeachment and more, if it's bad, it could affect his chances next time. Like, that seems like more of the thing that he could be concerned about.
Yeah, that's a good point too. It could become a part of the 2020 campaign. It could be a talking point or issue. Maybe what's revealed in the report itself could become a part of the campaign as part of criticism of Trump, or maybe a political issue could become taking some kind of action based on items in the report. So maybe people want to pass a law to restrict presidential power, or to take action against Trump himself. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be impeachment, but some law or some such in order to implement greater regulation and restriction on the ambit of what presidents can do or what presidential candidates can do. I think, for example, there was a law that was being considered that would basically make it mandatory for presidential candidates to release their tax records. Mm-hmm. So something like that could become a political issue in the election, and that could center around revelations in the report, depending on how people want to spin it. Again, I haven't seen the report. It hasn't been publicly released yet, so it's not clear what kind of revelations those may be. And it may be that sensitive things like that may end up getting redacted. So it's not really clear they may have that ammunition in any case. But if they do, then yeah, I would agree with you. That could definitely be a major point of contention in future. But I don't know that it would be a decisive one. Again, like we've discussed before, Donald Trump has survived far worse.
Yeah.
There's a reason they called him Teflon Don back in 2016. He survived, his candidacy survived far greater crises than other candidates could ever dream of surviving. So he seems to have an ability to defy normal public relations precedent in that regard. So I don't know that damaging material released in the report would necessarily be all that impactful on his core of support. And so that makes me skeptical that it would be decisive in the election. I think it would have to be something else.
Well, it also kind of fits with the image that he built with himself, too, which is if he gets in trouble, he just says, ha, yep, totally. Look at how tough and awesome I am. I don't even care. And everyone's like, whoa. This guy just, he doesn't apologize for anything.
Yeah. Well, that's the trouble. People are skeptical and cynical of the political establishment, and so they sought an outsider candidate and got one. So he doesn't have to be an angel. People didn't vote for him because he thought he was most people who voted for him didn't necessarily think he was like a really great person or awesome guy. It was more the fact that they voted more for what he was not rather than what he was.
Yeah.
There was a desire to get somebody who was not perceived as being on the inside, somebody who would shake things up, somebody who they thought would actually deliver on some of his campaign pledges that a lot of other presidential candidates made but had never really delivered on once they got elected. Things like dealing with free trade, dealing with, basically any number of issues that deal with working class America, especially in rural areas. That's a group that's had a lot of promises made to it over the past 50 years, but very little tangible gain to show for it. So well, I think his attraction stems more from that. And so because of that, all he really has to do to win really is just not be the establishment. And so long as he can paint himself like that, he has an inherent edge over almost any other presidential candidate. Hypothetically, you could run another outside candidate against him, but it's not really clear how well that would work. The U.S. tends to lean more to the political right, so there's kind of an inherent preference for conservative populism over left populism. And so that would put any potential democratic socialist alternative like Bernie Sanders, say, at something of a disadvantage. I know people like to point out that Bernie Sanders polled well against Donald Trump. I think, early mid 2016 is that when I think that's when they did those polls. But then the counter argument is that if he'd actually gotten the nomination, then there would have been any number of attack ads, and they would have picked apart his history. I mean, Hillary Clinton had more than a decade, probably 20-some years of conservative efforts, Republican efforts to try to undermine her and paint her as being, a very negative caricature. Not saying that's justified or not. I'm just saying that contributed to her public image, her public persona, and in particular the negative impression of her beyond just her politics anyway. But Bernie Sanders hasn't had that, so his image doesn't really have that tarnish. But if he'd won the nomination, he would have gotten the full blunt of that. He would have gotten that full political attack from his opposition, and it's not really clear how well he would have held up to that. Again, given how relatively critical Americans are of the far left and democratic socialist type policies. Again, not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that's why I don't know that he would have necessarily beat Donald Trump if he'd gotten the election, if he'd gotten the nomination. It's not the case that the polls that were made that looked favorable for him would have necessarily held up over time as his opposition started tearing into him and trying to undermine support for him. Not sure how I got onto that.
Well, how the Mueller investigation was going to affect his election chances in the next cycle.
Right. Yeah, I think basically he just has to be himself and continue to just try to make his opponents look as bad as possible, and basically free ride on the lack of trust in U.S. society at this point. That's kind of a secular trend that's been happening over the past couple decades. There's less trust in public institutions and more skepticism of leaders and establishment parties. So long as that continues, Donald Trump can kind of ride on that and lean on that to get votes. So that makes for an uphill battle for any opponent, because not only do they have to provide an alternative set of policies to Trump, but they also have to try to convince people to trust. And trust is a very difficult thing to inculcate in a society that's kind of losing it. But that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, that's just a long-winded explanation of why I don't think the Mueller report is necessarily going to be that important in the 2020 election. Relevant, yes, but I don't think decisive.
Mm-hmm. And then, relative to the Bernie Sanders kind of comparison of him versus Hillary versus Trump, this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they talk about StarCraft matches, is they'll say, well, if this one thing was different, then I would have won. So they'll say, well, if Bernie Sanders won the primary, then he would have beaten Trump. He may have had better chances, but it would have been a different interaction between Hillary and Trump as Sanders and Trump, because like you're saying, Trump's strategy is basically to attack whatever weak points and bad marks there are for his opponent rather than focus on himself and things like that. So he would have been trying to do that versus Sanders, and we don't really know what that would look like because it didn't really happen. Yeah. His target was Clinton, so.
Yeah, it's what you would call an impossible counterfactual. You can't really know exactly how it would have panned out. And I think there's grounds to be skeptical he would have inevitably won. I think it would have been close. It probably would have been a contest. But I don't know. I don't think it would have been inevitable like that. So yeah, that's a good point you make there. So that's the Mueller report, and then you also asked about Article 13, correct?
Yeah, and if I can give you an initial anchor of what I've read and seen so far, basically the community was kind of in an uproar about it, like that it was going to end the internet as we know it in the EU and all the streamers would lose their jobs and things like that. But there was a really nice post that kind of broke down the basics of how copyright works and how this would potentially affect people. Basically, the way copyright law works, as this person was putting it, and I'm kind of putting faith in this because I don't really know crap about it, is it's up to the copyright holder to decide if they're going to take issue with something and then submit a takedown request or some kind of punishment for someone who's using their stuff. So there's a lot of interactions that are kind of in a non-punishing relationship, such as games that are streamed on Twitch. You're not, as a streamer, getting official permission from every game developer to stream their game. You're just streaming it, and the game developers don't issue takedown requests because it's free advertising for their game. So it's good for them, even though you are using their game and you're not asking them directly if you can. They benefit from it, so they're not going to ask you to take it down. So basically, with Article 13, this seems like a way to flesh that out in a greater capacity that makes it look more dangerous for content creators, but it would still be up to these game developers to choose to end streaming in Europe or YouTube content creation and stuff, which would work against them in a very big way. So it seemed like a lot of the panic was a little bit overhyped, and then I did see the timeline, and it looks like basically the EU makes a decision, and then the EU member states have 2 years to create their version of putting this into law in their own country. And there's also a chance for them to contest this in their own country as well. So even though the EU said, you must do this thing, they can still contest it and say that they don't want to, and that would basically jam it up in the procedural pipeline and stuff. So it still seems like it's kind of in early stages, but it did take a decisive step forward with this recent vote.
Yeah, the EU Parliament passed it. That was kind of one of the last big hurdles. It's still not final implementation, and even if it does reach the point of final implementation, there's going to be a lot of leeway in terms of how individual states actually implement the law. One of the quirks of European Union laws are that they are not actually passed and enforced at the European level generally, unless it's like an administrative regulation or something for the EU Commission. A law like this is passed and then left to individual member states to pass equivalent laws and then enforce those laws on behalf of the European Union. So if you're an independent state in the European Union and you really don't like this law, then you could write your version of the law, which you again have to do as part of your membership in the EU. When you write that law, you could write it to be very loose. Basically, you can have very weak enforcement mechanisms. You can write it very ambiguously. You can basically leave yourself and state prosecutors lots of rooms to not have to take action and to make it relatively difficult for not content creators, but IP holders, for intellectual property holders to use the new law to protect their property, at least beyond what they could already do under pre-existing law. So yeah, I would agree that it's not the end of the world per se, and the law itself has been watered down over time, since it kind of started out. So you're not going to have to use a filter, if you do have a website where people are posting content. The EU and not necessarily the EU, but individual prosecutors are going to have discretion in determining whether or not you're reacting to copyright claims fast enough. And if they determine that it's not fast enough, then they'll take action. Even then, there'll still be a case, and you can kind of argue your side there, and it may come out that you're okay. But prosecutors will also have the discretion to decide, okay, you're responding slowly, but given your capacity, given your revenue, that's to be expected, so I'm not going to take action.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying that's, again, good or bad. People can make their own judgment on that. Having ambiguous laws is not great, because on the one hand, discretion means that laws will not inevitably be used in cases where they're not meant to be used, but it also makes it possible for them to be used in cases and in ways that it was not meant to be used. It can be abused, basically. Any kind of discretionary authority on the part of government actors, or really any actor, can be abused in that way. So that's the downside of ambiguously written laws like that. But in this case, I think they wanted to add that ambiguity to try to control for the fact that the internet is so diverse and that it's very hard to write legislation that directly addresses the specific issue they had in mind, that being IP protection, without impacting the whole ecosystem. And, again, threading that needle, balancing those two forces out, is very difficult. So they kind of resolved it here with ambiguity. Not a great solution, but it works. Hypothetically, it will anyway. We'll see how it works in practice once it kind of gets through the final stage there. But you'll still be able to post your memes on the internet, so people don't have to worry too much about that. And the website owners and operators, they won't have to worry too much about the state cracking down on them. The state really wasn't even thinking of small or medium-sized firms in the first place. They were really trying to home in on the big tech companies like Google, Facebook, etc. More so Article 11 in the case of Google, but everybody else, all of the other big tech actors, impacted by Article 13 in particular.
Yeah, a lot of people were feeling like it's going to impact the content creators, which it's basically what I do.
Yeah.
Those based in Europe. And there was also the fear that it would prevent viewers in Europe from watching content creators in general. So they were thinking that, say you're a viewer in Germany or the Netherlands or something, and you would have to use a VPN to watch Neuro, which is like, that seems like it would be really silly. But
could be exciting. Sounds very clandestine. Watching Neuro illegally over a VPN.
Ooh.
But that's roughly my understanding of it. We talked about it in more depth a couple months ago, I guess, and I kind of ran down through some of the specific changes that had been made to Article 13 over time and how they'd kind of watered it down. I don't know that I can look up those notes specifically just now, but I think it is out there on the VOD somewhere. But yeah, that's kind of reflects the net neutrality debate. Over here in the US, we had a big shift by the FCC in terms of its regulatory stance on net neutrality. So there was a big brouhaha about that, and it ended up going through. Net neutrality nominally ended up getting watered down, somewhere between getting watered down and abandoned outright. I don't remember exactly what the specific wording of the regulatory change was, but there was a lot of talk of the end of the internet, and it hasn't really quite panned out that way. I don't think there's been any serious abuses yet that we know of. Doesn't mean there's not any that we don't know of, but the internet still seems to be humming along more or less as it has before. Again, not saying that's good or bad. You can believe what you like. Just saying that's kind of where we are. And so it kind of reflects that debate in that sense, and that there was a lot of consternation and fear that ended up being a little bit overwrought. Not completely overwrought. There's definitely grounds for criticism, but it ended up being a lot of hype that maybe wasn't entirely deserved. This would probably be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not, as you can tell, an expert in everything I talk about. I have a stronger background in some areas than others, more economics and foreign policy, political economy. More of those topics is more my background. So I can talk with more confidence about those. Other subjects I'm weaker in. Some things in other subjects I know about just because I read the news or I read a report. And then some things I know even less about, maybe I just heard from somebody or read on Wikipedia. I try to be pretty upfront, or at least relatively upfront, with where on that spectrum I am when talking about a given subject. If I don't know something, then I'll generally say so and then just try to add something to it, because I don't know isn't a very satisfactory answer. So I try to give something to chew on with any given question. Sometimes I'm more successful in that than other times, but I make the effort anyway. So if I ever say something stupid, wrong, or biased, please do contribute in chat by pointing it out. I appreciate that. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. It is meant to be more of an interactive experience. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later after we're done here. so I will see your feedback eventually, and feedback is appreciated, since I am trying to get better at this. I know I tend to wax and wane with time, but it is an ongoing project, so your participation and feedback is appreciated in that regard. So that said, was there anything else you wanted to hit on here?
No, I think the rest of them I've put into the questions.
Gotcha.
I'm multitasking and tabbing out and doing questions and playing StarCraft 2. It's amazing.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize.
I know it's a strain. Well, we just
baller,
got to hold
dude.
out until we can get to the Pacific Theater. Well, let's see. First question. I read today that the world is $244 trillion in debt. How does the world as a whole lose money? Where did that money go, and what would it mean if we ever balanced the global budget? I'm not sure what's meant by how does the world as a whole lose money. I don't think it does, per se. I mean, the whole world is not a singular economic unit, right? The whole world is comprised of a whole multitude of different markets scattered around different countries and sub-markets and sub-nationalities, etc. So it's entirely possible for the world in aggregate to have a recession. I assume that's what you mean. I infer that's what you might mean when you say, how does the world lose money? It's not hard for multiple markets to enter a downturn, especially since markets are so interconnected now. So in that way, that it's you can see a significant drop in production, and then in turn a significant fall in wealth. Maybe it's, I don't know how familiar people are with wealth and income. That's an important distinction that you kind of learn early in economics. Income is roughly, just what you get paid. You get paid a wage or a salary or what have you. So that's your income. That comes as a stream across time. You get paid X amount of money per week, per month, what have you. Wealth is just the total value of all your stuff. That's a very generic way to describe it, but basically that's it. And so your house, your car, your computer, your Michael Jordan shoes, like whatever you got, all of that, the total value together is your total wealth. So that's separate than income. Wealth does change with time, especially if you're saving money and investing in stocks. Your stocks are part of the wealth, and obviously stocks and other things increase in value over time. So it is somewhat dynamic, but it's not as dynamic as income. Wealth in general is more fixed. So when you're talking about economies, the equivalent to income is GDP. That's how much is getting produced over time. And GDP refers to specifically expenditures. The flip side of GDP is income. And technically, a country's gross national income should hypothetically be equal to GDP, total amount produced, since everything getting produced is hypothetically being bought by somebody. So that's roughly equivalent to national income. National wealth, in turn, is just all of the nation's wealth, just all of the wealth of the country, all added together, all of the stocks, investments, property, land, just anything and everything that has value, all added up. So in general, national wealth is almost always going to be higher than national income. So the U.S., for example, produces something like 20-some trillion dollars per year in total production. That's its GDP, something around that, and somewhere between 17 and 20, I think. But the total wealth is way higher. The total wealth in the United States is something like 80 to 90 trillion dollars, something ridiculously high like that. Maybe that's total world wealth, and I'm getting confused, but it's higher, basically, significantly so. In fact, I think in the Great Recession back in 2008, the fall and the collapse, basically, in global markets resulted in the loss of something like $20 trillion of wealth, just because so many assets depreciated in value. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind when talking about money, basically. So when a country, when the world, I guess, because hypothetically it's possible to have a global recession, you're really talking about falls in income. But when you're talking about money, like this question does, hypothetically, that could also refer to wealth. So when you say, how does the world as a whole lose money, you could say that's just the world losing wealth. and that could come from recessions, different, new valuations and assets. There's any number of things that could cause that. So again, asking how does the world lose money is a little bit ambiguous, because I'm not sure if you're talking about production, i.e. recessions, that kind of thing, or if you're talking about total wealth, just the total amount of assets. You could hypothetically also be asking about just money in circulation, the actual, M1, M2, M3, etc. The actual amount of currency in circulation. You could hypothetically lose that too. It's normal to lose some just from attrition, even, because people will, I don't know, they'll wash their jeans with their money in their pocket, so then that gets crumpled up, and that's you're not technically supposed to use that. You can get that replaced, actually. But things like that, people lose money, it gets burned, whatever, stuff happens. So there's a normal amount of attrition that reduces the money supply. So even something like that could contribute to the world, quote unquote, losing money.
Well, the way that I would think about it, and I'm bad at economics and stuff like that, but from a StarCraft gaming perspective, the way that I see it is the value on the field, and the Earth is basically the map that we're playing on, right? And the total value that we have is all the material resource, all the individuals with skills who are adding stuff, adding tech to the economy, all the ships, all the planes, all the transportation, all the roads, all the infrastructure, all this stuff, it tends to be growing globally speaking. So you would say that we are net increasing our value. The debt that gets passed around is kind of like imaginary money that's being traded rather than that we are specifically losing stuff. For us to be like the world losing stuff, that sounds like an asteroid destroying a city or something. Because then you've lost a bunch of value, it's been destroyed. As opposed to this relationship where a country invests in your country and then they have some of your debt as someone's saying in the chat here, as an asset. So they have gained an asset. You have not lost value in your country. You have gained some of their money that they're kind of honoring you to use in a way, but parts of the earth have not been destroyed. The value is still increasing.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that money is a tool. It doesn't really have value unto itself. It's a means of facilitating trade. And that's especially useful if you're, say, a merchant, a wholesaler, a financier, etc., somebody who's moving large amounts of money. For people like that, having a lot of liquidity is very helpful, and currency is really the tool of choice for people like that. Obviously, different people have different interests at play. Some people would prefer gold or something of more fixed value. But for the big institutional investors and institutional economic actors, having a liquid currency that allows massive movements of currency very quickly, that's more beneficial for them, and that helps grease the wheels of the global economy as well as national economies. So in that sense, it's not really the debt that's necessarily the problem. It's more the liability that debt represents. Having some debt is fine, but if you start creating too much, then it creates a situation where you have a bubble. Basically, you have a lot of debt. It's assumed that the debt is going to be paid back, and so further economic decisions, usually by banks and whatnot, are made assuming that that money is coming at a later date. And when it doesn't, that upsets their economic timetable. That really upsets their balance sheet. So then they have to undo decisions. There's things they can't do that they were planning to do. And so there's just less opportunities in the market because there's less liquidity, because major financial actors are having to recalibrate their planning because now there's not as much money coming in. And it's normal for a certain amount of debt to be defaulted on. It's just kind of assumed by bankers and financiers that when they lend out money, some percentage of the loans they make are not going to be paid back. That's totally normal. The problem comes when that rate gets hiked. If the rate of non-performance reaches a certain point, then it really has a seriously deleterious effect on the health of businesses, banks, etc. And that has, in turn, knock-on effects on the overarching economy. Because financial institutions are so important to the health of an economy, they're basically the laissez-faire economic equivalent of a command economy central planners. You can kind of think of them like that. All of the money kind of goes through that sector. So when they have a problem, then everybody kind of feels it in turn. So that's kind of more the problem with debt. And right now, there's a lot of debt in the world because a lot of individual corporations and some state-owned enterprises, and also states have taken on a lot of debt over the past couple decades, in particular over the past, I want to say 10 to 20, because debt has been so cheap. Interest rates have been really low, so it's been relatively cheap to get a new loan or to refinance an existing loan. And if you're really desperate, you can just keep turning over loans. If you can't quite pay back your original loan, you can just get a new loan to pay it off and then just keep turning it over like that. And it's been relatively cheap to do that because interest rates have been low. So on the one hand, that's created a lot of dynamism in the market. A lot of people have been able to get resources, that is to say money, to do things that they might not have been able to do before, when money was more expensive, when loans were more expensive. But the downside is that there's a lot of slosh in markets. There's just a lot. It's been so easy for so long to get money that a lot of resources have been misallocated. There's been a lot of misallocation of capital, so to speak. Resources have been plowed into things that are pretty low return and relatively risky, and that just reflects that low interest rate environment. And if that goes on too long, then eventually that means that you're going to have a lot of debt that's non-performing, and again, that feeds back negatively into financial institutions and the overarching economy. Whether we're there yet is kind of unclear. Like this person points out, $244 trillion in global debt is quite a bit. But whether or not the global economy can kind of deal with that, still kind of an open question. And we've talked before about how we're kind of in a new economic world right now. There's been so many changes in the fundamental underlying economic structure of the global economy and individual national economies that it's kind of hard to apply pre-existing economic theory to the economy we have now, because it's a lot different than the previous economic conditions on which current economic theory is largely modeled. When you want to build a model, you have to use existing data. But if the new thing that exists, that emerges, if you want to model that, you kind of can't, because you need data, and you can't really have data until you've been able to observe something across time. And we haven't really been able to observe the new economy for long enough to generate the kind of data that economists would need to really model it. So that's still something in play. And I should point out that I haven't really been following economic literature that closely for the past few years. So I'm not up to date on that. So it might be that there's been more progress in that regard that I don't know about. If that's the case, please do post about it in chat. I would love to read about it. But my impression is that we're still very much learning what the new economy, so to speak, looks like, how it functions, how it reacts to stimuli, etc. It's very much something that we're still kind of in the process of understanding.
What an exciting time to be alive. We don't have enough data on the present to predict the future.
Yeah, it is interesting because you don't really know what could happen. I mean, it could be that we're in for a utopia. It could be that we've kind of inadvertently crossed into something resembling post-scarcity, which would be fantastic for the human race. On the other hand, we could all die because the global economy is unsustainable and collapses. So either way, we're in for an interesting ride because we don't really know what we're going to get yet. Fingers crossed.
Or it could be kind of meandering, slow, lumbering, and painstaking and boring. And it kind of stays the same. But we'll see what happens. And then this is the fun, refreshing difference. I feel like you're the perfect contrast to the doomsayers, like the people who make really solid, I don't say solid in the terms of correct. I mean, they make a very clear prediction that in 2035, there's going to be the AI convergence, like the Ray Kurzweil kind of character, who tells the world that I see the big picture, I've done the math, this is when it's all going to go down, buckle up and prepare yourselves. And for the purpose of selling books and TV ratings, that can take you pretty far, but it's oftentimes incorrect, so be aware. If someone makes a very specific prediction, I think that should be a red flag in general. You should maybe do some research and check to see what the other experts in the field have to say, because if it's really robust, and this is kind of how science works in general, someone does an experiment and maybe it seems groundbreaking, the immediate next step is for all of that person's peers to try to replicate it and see if they get the same result. Because if they don't, then there was probably a problem with how the experiment was conducted. And then it has less weight to prove whatever they're saying they've just proven.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of the scientific process. It's the thing that they really hammer into you when you're studying that when I was in the PhD program. One of the things that I didn't know before the program and that I really enjoyed learning about, because it kind of gave me a new perspective on things, is how to respect uncertainty, which is definitely not something you really see outside of that. In academia, the focus is very much on generating new knowledge rather than mastering existing knowledge. And that's a subtle difference, but an important one. Because when you're mastering established knowledge, then it's already there. You have confidence in it, and you just need to get it down. You want to remember it, you want to be able to practice it. But when you're trying to generate new knowledge, you really have to take a broader, more epistemological approach. And that's very difficult. But part of that process is learning about uncertainty. It's not just what we know, it's about what we don't know and understanding the boundary between them, because that's the boundary that you kind of live on as an academic trying to create new knowledge in your research. And respecting uncertainty, I think, is something that would go a long way towards helping, I think, ease a lot of public tension. It's kind of a tricky thing to nail down, though, because inherently it's ambiguous. Like, what do we know? What do we not know? And then what do we do with that? That's very hard to kind of figure out, because even trying to understand what you don't know requires to a degree that you understand what you're studying. And even that is difficult to do. But like you say, respecting uncertainty is a marked contrast with pretending that there's certainty when there's none. And I think that's one of the defining characteristics of our era. Not only in politics, but broader society. There is a lack of respect for uncertainty, I would judge. And that's me editorializing, definitely. So I don't want anybody to walk away from this hearing that, thinking that that's, some kind of established consensus in academia. This is just me editorializing. But that's my perspective. That is something that I didn't see outside the program. Once I'd been through the program, I kind of saw through that perspective, and it really wasn't something I saw very prominently in other fields or in broader society. So I think it's an interesting perspective. It's not really something that's practical. I don't think you can expect people to go through their lives thinking, oh, nothing is really true. How do I know that's true? Obviously, you have to have some focal points. You need to have some structure. But one of the things I try to do is just try to inculcate skepticism. You don't have to be completely skeptical, but be relatively more skeptical. Hew on the side of uncertainty rather than certainty. And that'll really change perspective, on a lot of issues, if not life in general.
A lot of that process, like skepticism, is trained. It's not innate. We've talked about credulity before during these sessions. But usually, if you think about it from a human psychological perspective, oftentimes people would prefer to have a bad answer than to have no answer. So for a lot of these really complicated things, if you have, on the one hand, a guy who's shouting and saying, guys, this is what it is, I figured it out. And then you have someone over here who's like, well, we don't really know. A lot of people would just prefer to go with the guy who seems like he knows what's going on. And they don't have the training to be able to discern the difference between a rigorous answer to a question versus a flimsy answer, but still an answer.
Well, to be fair, and you would know more about this than me because of your background, I think people have a bias towards useful information, even if that useful information is, as you point out, predicated on perhaps flimsy evidence. An answer that is flimsy but has the potential to be useful in life is more attractive than somebody who has good evidence for their answer, but whose answer is basically, we don't know. Have fun.
Yeah.
Because people don't like risk. People are inherently risk averse. That's a part of human nature. Obviously, there's a spectrum. Some people are relatively more risk tolerant, others relatively more risk averse. But in general, people hew towards risk aversion. And that being the case, people like to seek out information that can provide them tools in life to mitigate risk. And even if that tool is not necessarily likely to be effective, that's still preferable than a tool that, well, isn't a tool. Basically, somebody just saying, we don't know, it's uncertain, just live with the risk. That's not really a satisfactory answer for a lot of people. Actually, most people. So that being the case, there's an inherent bias towards that kind of solid information, even if it's not necessarily deserved. And again, you being more familiar with neuroscience, I'm sure there's some kind of cognitive bias that has a name of some kind for that. I don't remember what it would be, though.
Yeah, I don't know There's not really a particular phrase that's jumping out at me. The list of cognitive biases is very long. So if you want to just search Google, there's a Wikipedia page that's the list of cognitive biases. It's more than 50, I believe, in this list. It's hard to remember every single one. And there are a lot of them that, like you're saying, you can kind of describe the bias, but there isn't necessarily a word for it in the sciences yet. But yeah, this is something I'm going to be talking about a lot in a talk show I'm going to be on Tuesday. Oh, cool. You have to think about human psychology with the context of how we evolved to live like 100,000 years ago. This is a very new world with a lot of new situations that have no precedent. And we didn't evolve and adapt to sit at the computer and browse Reddit for dank memes. As much as we might enjoy that, like, this is a very new way to pass the time. Yeah. So we shouldn't really expect everything to just be in its proper place. Like, all of humanity has been leading toward this moment where we go to the office and sit in a cubicle. It's like, this is very out of context for the vast majority of how we've existed, which means that we need to account for that difference. Like, what was the daily rhythm of a hunter-gatherer, which is the organism that we evolved to be, versus the rhythm of an office worker? And how you can make really great contributions to society, but there are certain risks. Like, we're starting to learn about the problems with sitting for a certain amount of time in a day and how that's unhealthy. And you might think, well, not moving should be less risky than moving, but in the context of evolution, it makes sense. If we have a bunch of hardware that's been evolved to do certain things and it's unused, you kind of develop a sickness as a result of not using the hardware that you have. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Most people don't think about the context of their human body. You kind of just embrace, yep, I'm a 21st century person, this is the way the world is. But you miss the context of how much we've changed over the past several centuries. It's kind of an astronomical or exponential growth rate and change rate recently.
Interesting.
Well, compare the progress, for example, from 100,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, the amount of technological and social progress, and then stack that against the progress we've made in the last 1,000 years. Yeah. Technologically and socially, it's drastically different. Part of that is because of the population change. Another one is because of the exchange of information. It used to be that if you have some really clever guy in your tribe and he or she just figured out how to make fire, okay, that's cool. Your tribe can make fire, and now you can bully your neighboring tribes with a distinct advantage. But that's not going to go to the next continent. Whereas now it does. If someone makes some massive landmark discovery or change, then the whole world is going to figure it out eventually. And then everyone moves forward, and it becomes the new meta, you could say.
Yeah. And that process happens very rapidly now.
Yep, thanks internet, thanks telephones. I used to be a caveman like you, but then I had a telegraph. Now I'm a mad scientist.
That's the best kind. So let's see. I hope I got that first question okay. If not, if I ever don't answer your questions satisfactory, feel free to ask again and elaborate kind of what I missed or what you want me to home in on, and I'll be happy to return to them. So that said, next question. Could you speak broadly about the pros and cons of certain industries being privatized or run by the government, for example, the prison industry in the U.S.? I can speak broadly. That's just about my favorite way to speak.
That's my jam.
Simplifies speaking greatly. I highly recommend it. Let's see. So, pros and cons of privatization versus public ownership. So off the top of my head, because again, I haven't been studying this stuff in a while. So off the top of my head, the benefit of a privatization is, one, innovation. Privatized owners are more likely to innovate, come up with unique solutions, be more efficient, etc. And two, it's more cost effective. In general, because they're more efficient, they save money. So they do the same job, but with less cost. So that's kind of, in general, the advantages of privatizing an industry. Public ownership allows you to provide more of a given good than the private sector would provide if it were left to its own devices. So basically, you can shovel more resources into the industry that it could get on its own, and you could artificially increase the amount of service being provided, depending on what it is and depending on political preferences. So it's a kind of way of socializing both production and benefit. That's also something. When it's state-owned, then you get all of the revenue. The state gets the revenue, and then it can either plow that money back into the business and grow it, or more likely divert it to other areas that are considered more a higher priority. That can create some problems over the long term. In Mexico, they know about that because of Pemex, I think. That's the state-owned oil company? Maybe that's something else. But the state-owned oil company in Mexico has had problems with lack of investment because the government takes oil revenues and spends it on other priorities. They also have that problem in Russia, I believe. And, again, if I'm wrong on this stuff, somebody in chat please correct me. But this is from my this is what I'm remembering from what I read about it. So those are. But anyway, the point is the advantage of public ownership, though, is that you can, if you want those resources to spend on something else, you can do so, or you can expand that service to encompass a larger part of the population that would be serviced otherwise in a privatized system. So those are some advantages. Some disadvantages. I already kind of talked a little bit about the disadvantages of public ownership. Politicized operation of a state-owned enterprise is kind of, it has its strengths and weaknesses. Like I said, the strength is that you can subject the decision-making process to the priorities and preferences of the broader body politic. So that can be good if there's some social injustice that you want to correct, or that if there is some social injustice that was being caused in the first place by the company. So then public ownership kind of allows you to deal with that. But then the downside then is that politicized decision-making frequently is not very efficient decision-making. And generally it runs the business into the ground, depending on how bad it is. It can be done well. There are some places that are better at it. But in general, it's not going to be as efficiently run as it would be if it were privately owned. In general, that's true. With the private sector, or with privatized industries, the downside is just basically the flip side of that. Companies are prioritizing profit, they're prioritizing the business, and so sometimes that means they don't take into consideration social issues that maybe you would want them to. Something like in the environment, for example, is the classic case study. A company may, in the process of producing its good or service, produce a lot of pollution that damages the environment around the business, but then the business itself doesn't really have to pay for that directly. Maybe they don't bother with that. So they impose a negative externality on the economy that they don't themselves have to compensate for. That in general is sort of the downside. So the question also asks specifically about industries. So this is what I've described thus far as just a very broad description of strengths and weaknesses of privatization versus public ownership. There's a lot of variance there depending on individual industries. So for example, it actually could make a lot of sense to have public ownership of a company, of an industry that is a utility, basically like power generation, water treatment, things like that, in which a privately owned firm might struggle a bit to provide the degree of service that society would want. In general, we all want water. We kind of need it. So there's been a judgment call made that it's better to have a public water utility than to have competing private sector companies, because the utility provides not only broader coverage to include people that maybe couldn't afford privately provided water, but also to provide a greater degree of certainty. If you have a privately owned contract, certainty is a little more cagey than if it's publicly owned. If it's publicly owned, it's almost a right pretty much. So you have a pretty high confidence you're always going to get that water and that it will be decent quality, unless you live in Flint or something. But that's kind of a special case. In the case of a privately owned firm, it's a little more of a gamble. If you have a high value premium service, yeah, you're going to get good water. But if you're on a low priced, poor quality service, then maybe things are a little more dicey. So socializing that with a public utility kind of evens out some of the rough edges that a privately privately operated water distribution system might provide. So that in general, that's a case study kind of illustrating the issues there. And I'm sure somebody in chat has an example of a well-run private water system somewhere in the world. I'm sure somebody's tried it. If that's the case, please post it. I would love to read about it. I don't read as much economic stuff as I used to, but I'm still interested. So by all means, give me that case study. I'd love to hear about it. But keep in mind that this is just a broad outline.
One basic principle that applies for this question, and a lot of people, this is kind of a political question, is more privatized work or more government involvement better? If you're more libertarian or right-leaning, usually you say private is better. More left-leaning or whatever, you would say government is better and more reliable. But a lot of times it depends on the execution of how well the group in that area solves the problem. So you could have a certain area where they say, okay, we're going to have some private company solve this problem. We had an example with Puerto Rico where they had their big storm, stuff gets messed up. They hire a private company. It wasn't the right company to solve the problem, and it wasn't solved in a reasonable time frame in a good way. Flip side would be we have a bunch of really nice tollways in Texas that are super high quality, amazing to drive on. They're in great shape, super wide lanes, you can go really fast. Just some of the best roads you'll ever drive on. It's amazing. And they're private roads where the Texas government says, okay, we want a road here. You can build it, you establish the toll, and then you get the money back from people driving on it. It works. So it really depends on the people who are involved and how efficient the operation is. The government could have done that as well. If the Texas government decided we're going to make a highway here and then the toll goes to the government, if they execute it in the same way, it would work the same way at the end point. So it's not just what you're doing, it's how you execute it, if that's good and if that's efficient.
Yeah, and how that pans out is generally a function of local culture, local political preferences, etc. Local institutions as well. There's a plethora of factors that go into it. In Texas, politics is more conservative, so people trust the private sector a little more than the public sector. So in general, there's more of a preference for private sector solutions like that. But in other places, it's the other way around. And in general, they generally provide roughly equivalent services, depending on the place.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's a whole debate there in economics, I'm sure, about different case studies and whatnot. But broadly speaking, yeah, that I would agree with you on that. So let's see. That's an example. What I talked about water, so that's sort of the case of a case study and a good example of what would be a strong case for public ownership. So then, what about an industry where it's better with the private sector? So pretty much anything that's kind of like a small industry or that has a lot of small businesses, those are generally good examples of things that would probably not fare well if they were made into something like a public utility. If there was state ownership, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a publicly owned hot dog stand, for example. That's almost certainly going to be more efficiently operated by individual producers. And so that can scale up. Small to medium-sized businesses are generally more nimble and more efficient, more innovative than their larger counterparts even, let alone the government. And so those are good examples generally of industries, in so much as those given industries are dominated by smaller to medium-sized firms. Those are generally industries that are better off being privately run rather than publicly operated. So that's quick. That's speaking broadly, as requested, about the subject. There's a lot more to it than that. This is gross simplification from somebody who hasn't read about it in a long time. So anybody who's interested, I would definitely encourage to read more about it. Hit up Google Scholar and try to run a search for privatization, and you'll probably find quite a bit. Look for privatization literature review, actually. See if you can find a lit review. Lit reviews are super useful for getting a quick snapshot of where a given field of study is. It's not going to give you the full picture, especially since it's pretty rare for lit reviews to be done on a whole field. That's more of a subject for a whole book. But also, those books are worth reading if you have the time, but it tends to be an investment, and they tend to be very dry. But if you just want a quick snapshot of a specific part of a given field, yeah, a quick lit review that you find on Google Scholar can do wonders for you. So let's see. Can I go over the Ukrainian elections? I can briefly go over them. I haven't been following them too closely. So basically, the incumbent president in the Ukraine right now, and I'm going to focus on the presidential election because I have no idea what's going on with the legislative election. I'm sure they correspond with one another. Actually, I'll make a note to look into that because now that I mention it, I'm a little curious. Elections. Okay. So as for president, the incumbent president is a guy named Poroshenko, and he's the big chocolate king. He's an oligarch, and he made his money. He makes his money by owning a range of confectionery businesses. And he became president after all of the Maidan drama back in 2014 went down. I'm not going to get into that again. But, well, we can if somebody wants to. But suffice to say, he became president after that, in the aftermath of that, and he ran on a nationalist platform. And at first, people had high hopes that he would kind of, for one, lead the fight against the rebels, quote unquote, in eastern Ukraine and then the Crimea. But also there were hopes that he would steer the country closer to Europe and fight corruption. So he has more or less held the line in eastern Ukraine. But as for anti-corruption, not nearly so much progress made there. And that's disappointed a lot of people because that's one of the big areas where Ukraine and Ukrainians in particular really want to see improvement. So his approval ratings are not great, and it's not looking like he's going to be reelected. It's always possible, but he's, I think, third place now in the polls. So second place in the polls is Yulia Tymoshenko, and some people who've been watching the news for a long time might remember her from the 2004 Orange Revolution. I think it was 2004, wasn't it? I want to say 04. And so that was, well, I won't get into that again, unless somebody wants to, but suffice to say, long story short, a reform government came to power, and she was part of that. She was herself a populist, I think a left populist more, but also a nationalist populist. And she's also kind of an oligarch. I think she makes her money off of gas, that is to say, natural gas. She kind of fell out of popularity after Maidan, I believe. She had been put in prison by the Yanukovych government before Maidan, and so she was kind of cooling her heels in jail for a while. And then afterwards, she kind of came out and tried to kind of capitalize on the fact that she'd kind of sort of been a political prisoner. There's a fine line in countries like Ukraine between political oppression and elite rivalry. You know, there's so many oligarchs and elite dominance of Ukrainian politics that it's hard to kind of distinguish between personal rivalries between elites and outright repression. You know, kind of a blurry line there. But technically, she was a political prisoner, and she tried to make hay off of that after she got out, but it didn't really go anywhere because the public mood was kind of against oligarchs. It didn't stop Poroshenko from getting elected, but in general, people were pretty skeptical of her. Also, she had kind of been a little buddy-buddy with the Russian government when she was in government herself. She'd been a little friendly with Gazprom. So that kind of rubbed nationalists the wrong way, too. So she was kind of out of the public eye for a while, a couple years. And, you know, if we have Ukrainians listening, please correct me on any of this I'm getting wrong. If you haven't already, you know, keep me honest. I'm running on memory here. So, yeah, she was out of the public eye for a while, and then she kind of came back in the past couple months, I think. And basically, she was kind of running on a platform of anti-corruption, populism, you know, helping people pay their bills, especially gas bills, that kind of thing. And normally that's pretty good vote winner in Eastern Europe, but people are still skeptical of her because she's technically still an oligarch. You know, she's still one of the established elites. I think she was in the lead of the poll, leading the polls for a while at the end of last year, but she fell to second place because a new guy took the lead in the polls, and this new guy is kind of an unknown. He's actually an actor. We talked a little bit about him before, I think. He's an actor named Zelensky, I want to say, something to that effect. I don't remember exactly.
Sounds familiar.
But yeah, but he was an actor in a TV show in the Ukraine in which he actually played the president. He was the gist of the show is that he was just a common everyman, and then he ended up becoming president. And so it was about his fight against corruption, basically, as a sort of regular Joe president. So that's how he got to be known, and then he started running for president, basically on an anti-establishment, anti-corruption platform. And he's particularly popular amongst younger folks, younger voters. No shock, you can see that. Whenever there's a young reformer who comes out of nowhere and just starts talking a lot about anti-corruption, invariably, almost invariably, that person seems to be popular with younger voters. You can see that phenomena pretty much all over the world. There's a political reformist party in India called Ahmad something, AAP is the acronym. So they're very popular with young people. In Russia, I think it's Alexei Navalny, who's popular with the younger folks. So it's a very frequent dynamic. Barack Obama did that back in 2008. So in the Ukraine, it's this guy. He's sort of the face of reform, face of anti-corruption. He's not an established party guy, so people kind of like him for that. There's a sense that he could really augur in significant change in Ukraine, not only in terms of leadership, but political culture, which is really kind of where the heart of the problem lies as far as corruption. The criticism of him is that and this is the criticism of a lot of reformist candidates, is that he's kind of a one-note guy. He just talks generically about anti-corruption, but doesn't have a lot of specifics. It's not really clear how you can really change the political culture in Ukraine. I mean, changing a political culture is inherently difficult because there's no one way you can do that. There's not like any established toolkit by which you can guaranteed 100% change a political culture in a given direction. So to come out and say you want to change it is great, but there's not really any substance or details as to how to actually do that because nobody really knows how to do that. But the fact that he's even promising it is kind of what makes him attractive. But again, the skepticism is, what is he actually going to do? What is he actually promising? And there's not a lot there, really. And also, apparently, the owner of the TV station that played the TV show he was on was himself an oligarch, and so there's some suspicion that this guy may be a front candidate, basically, for that guy, for that oligarch. I don't think I read his name, but it was mentioned in passing. So there may be some skepticism there as well. He's got youth and energy on his side, and he has a skeptical public on his side. I mean, how much worse can he do? Is going to be the attitude. That's always a dangerous thing to ask, so I would be a little wary of that. But in general, people are hopeful. So he's leading the polls right now. In Ukraine, they have runoff elections. So if the winner of the presidential election does not get past a certain proportion of the votes, they'll have a runoff in which the top two vote getters run against each other. So if that happens, I'm not real sure how that'll pan out. I don't think his lead is really super high. So hypothetically, it's possible he could lose a runoff, I think. Somebody following Ukrainian politics more closely than I am can kind of maybe elaborate on that in chat. I don't know if we have any, but hopefully someone is. But I don't think it's guaranteed that he'll win. But right now, technically, he is leading in the polls. So it's possible that he could become the next president of the Ukraine. That would probably mean improved relations with Europe and probably at least an attempt to address corruption. But whether or not he'll be able to make substantial headway is unclear. Electing a reformist president is always well and good, but if he doesn't have backing in a legislature, it's pretty much just symbolic. He's basically a symbolic figurehead at that point. So he's going to need to build a coalition. If he does become president, he'll need partners and allies in the legislative branch in order to really enact his vision for reform in Ukraine, if indeed it is a substantive vision and not just a front for more corruption. And that can be very difficult to do, especially if a lot of the major political actors in the legislature are themselves establishment corrupt political figures, if not outright oligarchs. In that case, he's going to have to make a lot of compromises that'll probably disappoint his followers. Maybe there'll be compromises that are worth it in the long run to make progress, but it's not probably going to be what his voters will have had in mind. It could create problems for him later. That's assuming that he doesn't meet massive resistance in the legislature and just can't do anything. That's also possible. But at this juncture, it's unclear just what the future holds in that regard. Right now, we just know that an unusual outsider candidate is leading the polls. That's kind of where it is right now. And again, I don't really know pretty much anything about the legislative elections. I assume those are also coming. So I'm not sure what the distribution of power is there. I think conservative right-wing parties had pretty much carried the day after Maidan and have been pretty much the dominant groups in Ukraine. But I don't know how true that still is, and I don't know how much those parties had been captured by elite interests. It's not hard for an oligarch or someone to fund a populist party of any given type and to have them be their sort of guy in parliament, or the legislature, rather. So I don't know how authentic the established political parties in Ukraine are right now, or in contrast, the degree to which they've been captured by interest of one sort or another. That's something I'd have to read more about to comment on.
So a fun thing about answering that question is there was someone else who asked that as well, so I just got to delete the second instance of it in the queue. Good job. You just got two birds with one stone.
Nice. Efficiency.
We got interest in Ukrainian elections.
Okay. Let's see. Update on Brexit. Such a short question, but such a big topic.
Well, the thing that I saw as a headline was there's another petition. And one thing that maybe you could shed some light on in general is, do petitions do anything? Because they say some number. It's like 2 million people signed this petition. It's like, okay, but my immediate thought was the referendum was really close to 50-50, and it was way more than 2 million people on either side. So to get 2 million people to sign it is not an achievement. It seems like
it's kind of like the polls you see on cable TV news channels. Occasionally, like CNN or MSNBC or Fox or whatever, they'll throw up an internet poll that they had, and they said, we held a poll about this, that, and the other, and it turns out everybody agrees with our bias, whatever that bias may be on the given channel. So yeah, that's pretty much what petitions are. They're a rough gauge of how many people agree with that specific position. That's what petitions are for. But unless you have a specific mechanism in your government that actually requires the government to act on a petition, then petitions are pretty much purely symbolic. And I think that's the case with the Brexit petition. I don't think that the government has to actually do anything about that.
Yeah, well, I think to give context, a petition is going to have the most impact if it tells a group something they didn't already know.
Yeah.
So there's a fun example. I'm pretty hyped for Classic WoW coming out, and there was a report on the history of people asking for it, and there have been a bunch of different expansions and stuff for the game, and people have been asking for the initial one for a long time, and Blizzard has said no, no, no all this time. And there was a petition that got a bunch of people who said that they would prefer this over the other, and it's in the, I think, close to 1 million people, where for them that's revenue that they could potentially get if they follow through with this thing. And they didn't really have a way to measure that in metrics. They didn't really take a poll themselves, so they just got some data that they didn't have before by this petition coming through. As opposed to a Brexit petition, they already got the data with the referendum, and maybe there are a few swing votes in either direction, but the only really convincing petition would be one that did something like a 60-40 in the opposite direction of the referendum. So you have the number of votes on either side, and then you do a petition, and suddenly 10% of the people who voted to leave the EU now vote to stay. Then they're going to be like, okay, wow, maybe some big stuff changed and we need to reevaluate. As opposed to 2 million, that's like a drop in the ocean.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a valid point. Information is itself useful, even if there's no obligation to honor the petition's objective, whatever that may be. So yeah, new information can be useful in that regard. That does make a otherwise purely symbolic petition have value that it would not have otherwise. But in this case, like you point out, yeah, it's not really saying anything that people didn't already know, which is that a lot of people don't like Brexit, which is not going to be news to anybody in the UK or outside the UK at this point. So that's the petition anyway. I as for the actual Brexit negotiations, I actually went out of my way to try to summarize the notes, because periodically I take notes when there's a new development, but I haven't talked about it in a while, so they've kind of been piling up. So I had to create sort of meta notes summarizing them. So let's see. Late March, there was a vote. This is starting at late March. I think more or less that's the last time we talked about it. Well, this is late March. Well, whenever it was, a couple weeks ago, there was another vote on May's deal, and it failed again. And so that triggered a vote on a no-deal Brexit, which failed because most people don't want that. And then it triggered a vote on whether or not to delay Brexit. And I believe that vote passed. So people in Britain loved Brexit so much, they basically voted to have some more of it. So there's been an extension in the negotiations. Instead of leaving mid-March, as was intended, I believe it was it was the end of March, wasn't it? Well, it's been delayed by a couple weeks, and now it's technically mid-April. And the EU agreed to grant that extension. They technically didn't have to, but there was a consensus reached in the European Union that it was necessary. And they decided that they should be flexible in terms of extensions requested by the UK. And they wanted to do that, for one, just in case the UK needed time to, the UK does need more time for negotiation, but also just in case they wanted more time to do something like hold another referendum or have a major renegotiation or, any such thing. Or hold a new election even, something like that. So there was a sense in the EU that they needed to be flexible to allow time for those kinds of contingencies. The European Union also backed off of demanding that the UK pass the deal that had been negotiated with Prime Minister May. It was kind of determined that that was causing more resistance amongst skeptics in the UK than it was galvanizing support amongst supporters. So they dropped that, and they're just kind of leaving it to the UK to figure it out themselves at this point. That said, there's more discontent in the European Union than there was before. Not everybody is really happy about how dragged out the process has become. France in particular is pretty skeptical about long-term delays. They agreed to the short-term delay, but they're a little wary about further delays that might extend the process significantly into the future. The French attitude is that it would be better just to get it done sooner rather than later, and there's a growing attitude in France and other countries that maybe it would just be better to go with the no-deal Brexit, maybe even force a no-deal Brexit just to get it out of the way, just so that the issue can finally be done with and they can move on to other things. Economic partners of the UK, like the Netherlands in Europe, nominally they're inclined to be a little more lenient, but even they are kind of getting tired of the uncertainty at this point. Germany, for its part, is still pretty lenient, so that's kind of the big leader of the pro-give more extensions faction in the European Union. So what does the delay involve exactly? The new deadline is April 12th. That's not necessarily a hard deadline, though. If an agreement is made by then, the UK will have until May 22nd to ratify the agreement. If no agreement is made by April the 12th, then the UK has to offer some alternatives. So hypothetically, there will still be some time left in that case. So after the extension was granted, Prime Minister May pushed for another vote on her deal, but then there was a surprise. The Speaker of Parliament, I think his name is Barclough, he stopped it, basically. He prevented the vote from happening, and he argued that the government can't just keep calling votes on the same thing over and over again to try to get people to change their votes on it. And so, the argument that he made was predicated on parliamentary precedent, and apparently it was an unusual precedent to cite. Pretty unusual for a speaker to do that, but such is the times we live in, basically. So his demand was that he would not allow further votes on May's Brexit deal unless there were substantive changes to it, such that it could be described as a significant new vote rather than a rerun of a previous vote. So Prime Minister May got around that requirement successfully by holding a vote just on the departure aspect of the deal. So the vote was not on her deal as a whole, but rather just the part of the deal that involved leaving the European Union. So basically a technicality. And that vote failed too. So after that vote failed, Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, asked for a general election, and some Tories even started calling for her to step down. So Prime Minister May responded to those demands by promising to step down if her deal was passed. So that's the new quid pro quo. I'll get out of your hair if you just pass the damn deal. So some pro-Brexit Tories have started coming around on May's deals. There's a lot of hard Brexit people who have been opposed to May's deal principally because they don't like the backstop, among other factors, but they don't like the idea that that the UK might be forced into the backstop agreement if there's no agreement after the 2-year transition in which a new free trade deal is supposed to be negotiated. They would like some kind of power given to Parliament to get out of that if need be, if the circumstance should come to that. But now they're starting to change their mind. One, they've never gotten along with Prime Minister May, and they like the idea that she'll actually step down. So that's won some people over. And two, they're starting to think that they won't have the support to get a harder Brexit than they're getting. Obviously, a New Deal Brexit is hypothetically possible, but unlikely, because most people in Parliament are opposed to that. So as they've tried to push for a hard Brexit and people's preferences have been revealed, it's becoming more and more apparent that they're not going to get the support that they want for the kind of hard Brexit that they're looking for. So now they're starting to come around for that reason as well. So Prime Minister May has been getting more votes from them over time recently because of some of those factors. So the latest thing was an indicative vote, or more accurately, indicative votes. And these votes were basically made to try to gauge support for different options on the path forward. And 8 different options were voted on to try to gauge that support. One option was a no-deal Brexit. That pretty much speaks for itself. Another one was Common Market 2.0. Basically, that involves membership in the European Economic Association, which is basically regulatory alignment, having the same regulations, being roughly a part of the single market, but not necessarily with a customs union in place. You could hypothetically have your own customs and then separate trade deals with other places, whatnot. So EEA, but with Common Market 2.0, that would be combined with a temporary customs union until some kind of alternative arrangement could be reached. So that's Common Market 2.0. Another option voted on was EFTA/EEA, so basically European Free Trade Area / European Economic Association. This would involve no customs union, but with regulatory alignment. Also, the Irish backstop would be replaced with some kind of alternative, because that you can't really do a customs union like that with that in place. So then, another option, outright customs union. Just have a customs union, basically. That speaks for itself. Another option, customs union, but with close alignment, quote unquote, with the EU. This is basically Labour's alternative plan, to have a customs union, but then voluntarily have some kind of regulatory alignment with the EU to retain some access to the single market. Another option, revoke Article 50, which would stop Brexit altogether. Again, speaks for itself. Another option, a confirmatory public vote, which hypothetically would just require parliamentary approval for any final agreement. So basically, you would negotiate anything, any kind of agreement of some kind, and then if this were implemented, then Parliament would just have a final say. So that's kind of the weakest, softest option being discussed. And then the final option voted on was Malthouse Plan B, in which the UK would pay the European Union to stay in the single market during the 2-year transition while some kind of alternative arrangement was negotiated. So basically extending Brexit negotiations through the next 2 years into the 2-year transition period, but retaining the current economic relationship by paying into the EU budget, which they had originally not intended to do. So Neuro, what do you think the outcome of these votes was?
Memes.
Well, that's always accurate.
You laugh, but I'm right, aren't I?
It's true. I can't deny it. So the actual outcome is that none of these options received a majority vote in Parliament.
Yes!
All of them failed.
Sweet. What did I win?
You won memes, of course.
Fantastic.
So that's pretty much where Brexit is right now. Pretty much a stalemate, with no clear direction or aim, and with a lot of people very upset at the ongoing uncertainty, especially in the private sector and in the European Union. I'm still betting that Theresa May's plan will be passed eventually, or at least some form of it, because I don't know that there's really any alternative. Hypothetically, it's possible for Brexit to be stopped altogether, but I'm pretty skeptical that'll happen. They're probably going to leave the European Union, I suspect. But again, what's at debate is how close a relationship will be maintained with the European Union, and that's anybody's guess at this point. I still bet May's plan, but who's to say? But that's where it is. That's a quick summary. So let's see. Do you think the inverted bond yields are as significant as everyone is making them out to be? Would love to hear your thoughts about it if the economy is actually strong or if real red flags are going off. It is inverted bond yields are a pretty solid predictor of recession. I think the problem though is that, and this was actually pointed out to me in chat because I made this mistake. The bond yields that inverted were, I believe they were short-term bond yields, like 5-year. I shouldn't say short-term. I should say 5-year, 5 to 10 year, I think, bonds. And those are not the principal bonds that you would look at if you were trying to predict a recession. Generally, what's used are, I think, the 10 to 20 year bonds. And those have actually not inverted yet. I believe that's the case. So 5 to 10 year bonds are inverting. That could mean a recession is coming, but without the inversion of the 10 to 20 year bonds, that kind of throws it into doubt a little bit. So I think in general, if you're curious about the health of the economy as a whole, it's doing okay. It's a little bit on steroids right now because of the big tax break that was passed, I think, last year. So it's kind of running through that stimulus. It's kind of nearing the end of that cycle, though. So how the underlying economy is doing is kind of debatable, and you'll get conflicting information on that. Probably there's a lot of variance depending on region and industry, I would expect. The global economy is kind of sputtering a bit, so exports are not a great driver right now. There's been some pickup in coal and steel because the Trump administration has been implementing policies favorable to those industries. But then there's been negative knock-on effects to industries that use coal and steel as inputs. So that's kind of the downside there. I think in general the economy is still growing, but it's probably going to calibrate down into a relatively low equilibrium. Yeah, I'm not really sure what would be driving economic growth at this point. Obviously, there's the usual stuff, energy, healthcare in particular. With the population aging, you can expect the healthcare sector to keep on booming. But as for innovation-driven growth, given industry is growing based on growing demand, it's not really clear where that core sort of growth is right now. And somebody more familiar with the economy would know more about that than I would. Following market news too closely lately, I've been reading more about mid-20th century Latin America because of this podcast I'm working on. But hopefully, if we have somebody like that who has a better background there, maybe they can point out some industries that are really doing well and some that are dragging. I'm sure chat would appreciate that. I know I would. But that said, yeah, I think in general it's going to reach an equilibrium where it's like 1 to 2% GDP growth per year, probably, I would guess. A recession is possible. We've been technically in a period of economic growth for a very long time now. So that being the case, it would make a lot of sense for there to be some kind of economic downturn. Just because of the business cycle, you would expect a downturn to follow a long period of growth. And there are some signs that we're heading in that direction. Again, the 5 to 10 year bonds inverted. There's some worry about bubbles and I think auto loans, certainly student loans to a degree, although that's kind of debatable. So yeah, there are some red flags out there, but I don't know that any of them are like catastrophic. I think some of the big red flags right now are actually in the rest of the world. A lot of people have been pointing out that a lot of governments around the world have a lot of debt. A lot of individual corporations around the world have a lot of debt. So those are more kind of the problems for the global economy, and that's kind of more the vector through which another recession would probably come. It could happen in the U.S. for something that I don't know about. That's entirely possible. There's quite a bit I don't know, but I'm not sure what that would be right now. So we'll see. But I think in general, the economy right now is doing pretty well. It's coming off a pretty strong growth spurt from that stimulus. We'll see where it goes from here. But I just don't really know what would drive further growth, though. I don't know what would drive further endogenous growth. And that's kind of what I would be curious about for those who follow it more closely. So, that said, let's see. The research at Kern is funded by a cumulative 2% GDP of every country in the EU. In that respect, there is now a political incentive to scientific research. How do you think this relates to the climate change debate and grants being offered on a political basis? Do you feel as though science has become a political tool? Let me think about that a minute. Because I haven't heard about this 2% GDP thing. Cumulative 2%. So every country contributes 2% of its GDP, or just the total amount of funding is equivalent to 2% of the GDP of the European Union as a whole? Because I hadn't heard about individual contributions being required. 2% of GDP would be a lot. That would be a lot to expect from Romania, Poland, etc. So I would be a bit surprised by that, but I could be wrong. I'm a bit curious. But that said, I guess regardless, in that respect, is there a political incentive to scientific research? I don't really think so. I mean, I think most scientific research is still relatively apolitical. Obviously, there's still some that's politicized. Climate science obviously has become like the big example of a politicized topic. Not to say that the science itself is politicized, but the topic of climate change is very politically charged. So some people support or oppose support for research of topics like climate science for partisan political reasons rather than for scientific reasons. I don't think it's a stretch to say that much. I don't know that it creates an incentive, though, to scientific research. It does create a new impetus for it, and I guess that's but an incentive would suggest that there's some benefit. Incentive is a different word. That would imply that there's some kind of economic benefit there that people are chasing. They're specifically trying to fund scientific research because they're after some perceived benefit, specifically some kind of financial benefit or otherwise. But I think it's more, I think when it comes to political motivations, like incentivization from perceived political importance, that's just more of a values judgment. So I wouldn't really call that an incentive per se. That's just political preference. That's kind of splitting hairs, I know, but that's what's coming to mind anyway. How do you think this relates to the climate change debate and grants being offered on a political basis? I guess I would have to read a lot more about it because I'm not a big environmental policy person, so I haven't been following it too closely.
I would say it is a little bit of a scientific disservice to say that it is an even-handed debate. The fact that climate is changing is not up for debate based on the metrics. Whether it's human caused is maybe closer to an appropriate question. I think politically speaking, there are industries where it serves them to just say that there is no climate change. But if you're looking at year to year, the extremes of temperature, the way that the ice is melting, the average temperature increasing over time, graphics are just constantly being pushed out. So a lot of people have given the ground, and I know some specific examples where 5 years ago they said climate change is made up, and then we've had way more, what do you call them, hurricanes and major catastrophic events recently. The Great Barrier Reef is toast. Just stuff that is unprecedented that's happening, and it's harder to deny it straight up. So now they're saying, well, is it our fault or is it just part of the natural cycle of things? So, yeah, there is political involvement, but the science is heavily leaning in one direction.
Yeah, but I don't know about, I think he's referring specifically to state allocation of resources to that research. And I don't know enough about that process in the European Union to really comment on it. So I'd probably have to punt on the question then. Don't know enough about that to really comment intelligibly. Do I feel as though science has become a political tool? Now that's more specific. For some it is. I think for some people it's definitely become a political tool. Some people use it, to push for policies, some to argue it against policies, and for various motivations. But yeah, I think to a degree it is. Whether it is to a degree that's unusual, that's a little more ambiguous. Because there's always been debates and disputes in the scientific community. And those debates generally bleed over into politics, although generally in a very different form. So I don't know that necessarily the current dispute over climate change is necessarily different from previous iterations of politicized science. I think maybe the internet kind of makes it seem like it is. We live in the information age with social media, the internet, whatnot. So we get sort of blasted in the face with the climate change debate every day, pretty much. And the result is that it kind of feels like that particular scientific issue has become a lot more politicized than previous scientific issues. But maybe it's just that we have a larger megaphone that the debate is being yelled through. So it just kind of feels that way when really it's not. But that said, I would reiterate, not really my field. Not quite my area of expertise, unfortunately, so I can't.
The sobering note to realize, too, is most people, like your average citizen, doesn't really care that much. Either way, you get the people who are extremely to one end or the other, and they're really noisy. And your average moderate person is kind of like, does this affect me and my job and my rent and my day-to-day? No. Okay, whatever. So just bear that in mind, too, when people are screaming at the top of their lungs.
Yeah. It can be hard to be engaged. Politics can be a lot to take in. Well, it is a lot to take in. It tends to attract very strong personalities. If you're just kind of a mellow person, it kind of turns you off. So, understandable. And like we've talked about before, you can't really expect people to probably sound like a broken record talking about this over and over again, but it can't really be expected that everybody should be an expert in everything. You have to take shortcuts, heuristics, etc. It's not reasonable to expect people to be up on everything just to the fullest degree. So people have their pet issues that they follow more closely than others, and even among those, they have trusted sources of one sort or another that they kind of depend on to be honest with them. And they may or may not be entirely honest, depending on their nature. So, yeah, it's a tough gig being politically engaged. It's just hard to find all the information you need and then to parse it, and at the same time have a life. Go to work, deal with your responsibilities, etc. So, let's see. Do we know how barter economies actually functioned before currency? I have a hard time believing it's like Intro to Econ textbooks conjecture. After the World Economic Forum ended, the biggest topic was the historian that called out business leaders for not paying their fair share of taxes. Is there a multi-international interest in standardizing taxes? Oh, these are two separate questions, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm doing this during the game, so it's not going to be as fancy or pretty as your usual person.
No problem. It just kind of took me a minute. It kind of took me a minute to process the change in the question. Okay, do we know how barter economies actually functioned before currency? I have a hard time believing it's like Intro to Econ textbooks conjecture. I don't remember enough of what my econ textbook conjectured to know what it was describing bartering as. Basically, it was just exchanging goods and services, probably mostly goods, one for the other, rather than using some medium like currency. But I would think it would be pretty straightforward. But yeah, I would really have to look it up, though. I would have to look up what the textbook answer to that would be. What is the textbook econ answer to bartering, description of bartering? Yeah, that's kind of more of an economic history type question. I don't know that a lot of economists study bartering all that much. They're definitely do to a degree, because there have been examples of bartering that have happened in the modern era. It's actually not that unusual. I mean, obviously it still happens a lot in relatively undeveloped societies, where you still have very traditional ways of life and traditional economic systems in place that usually involve some degree of bartering. But it's also happened even in relatively developed parts of the world. Argentina is the example that comes to mind. In Argentina, there was a big financial crisis around 2001, I think. And as part of that, one of the things that people did to cope with that and the subsequent economic turbulence was to basically form a big barter market in which you could just bring stuff and trade it for stuff you needed. or even services. I think there was even a guy there who was trading haircuts for stuff. And I think at one point they even started issuing their own currency, which in a way is telling, I guess. It's kind of, people tend to hew towards currency because, again, it is a useful tool. But yeah, bartering pops up even in the modern era, where economic systems are going through a tough patch, and especially involving lack of liquidity, where there's just a lack of currency or income of one sort or another. But I guess more specifically, before currency, just specifically, how did barter economies function before currency? They were probably pretty localized, for one, because before currency is a long time ago. Currency is pretty old. Pretty much everybody throughout most of the history of civilization has used some kind of currency, be it gold coins, copper coins, seashells, copper circlets. There's any number of things that have been used as currency. The famous one that gets brought up all the time is the Pacific Island, where they have these big giant stones. I think they're big giant stone circles, and they weigh a lot. They're very heavy, and because they're so heavy, people can't really carry them around and use them like you would normal coins, right? They are currency, mind you. They have value and they're used to trade for things, but they're just so heavy it's not practical to carry them around. So what they do instead is everybody just remembers who owns which one, and they just kind of leave them in place. Yeah. Which in a way is a kind of, well, not bartering, obviously, but it kind of illustrates how advanced a currency system can be even in a relatively traditional society, right? They're still trading with currency, but it's purely in their heads. It's purely symbolic. There's no actual physical good kind of trading hands. Technically there is, but nobody's actually moving them, so really it's just symbolic pretty much. But yeah, barter economies in traditional societies that don't use currencies are generally heavily localized, probably more tribal in nature, and generally they involve trading for specific things that they need or want. Maybe food, for example, if they're having a shortage, or tools, if they have somebody who has a particular tool that they want that they can't make themselves. But it tends to be pretty rudimentary from what I remember, from what I'm thinking of it as anyway. It's not super advanced. Generally the more advanced economic trade becomes, the more likely you are to hew towards some kind of currency or credit-based system, because that just makes trade easier.
Well, to break it down, the reason for why currency is so valuable is it increases the versatility of your value, where maybe the good that you have in abundance, the other person doesn't need at all. But
Yeah.
you have value, like you're pumping out value of some item, and that's a way of basically having, as we say, liquidity. You have a liquid form of value, and you can represent that even if the person you're trying to trade with doesn't want what you're selling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent summary. Yeah, that is it. That's the crux of it in a nutshell. It allows you to trade for things that you might not be able to otherwise get, given your resources available to you. Maybe not everybody needs corn, but maybe that's all you have. So what are you supposed to do then? Well, maybe you've got some currency lying around that they value, and they can take that, and then they can spend it on things that they do need. That's not corn. So yeah, that is the utility of currency, the basic utility of currency. Broadly speaking, in a modern economy, the benefit also includes liquidity and just ease of getting loans and having a means of exchange that you can manipulate on a policy level, central banks and whatnot, to help deal with economic crises. But yeah, I'm not familiar. I don't remember what the textbook definition of bartering is, so I can't quite address that part of the question. Excuse me. After the World Economic Forum ended, the biggest topic was the historian that called out business leaders for not paying their fair share of taxes. Is there a multi/international interest in standardizing taxes and not making it possible for companies to avoid taxes? How could or should this be done? Yeah, that's kind of a normative thing, whether or not that you want a world where everybody's taxes are calibrated such that tax evasion becomes kind of pointless, futile. I think most people would say that's probably desirable in so much as it involves fighting tax evasion. But then the problem you face is the incentive to cheat. If you do have a system where everybody promises to have the same tax systems, the more people who implement the same tax system and eliminate the incentive to use their country for tax evasion, the greater the incentive becomes for an individual country to defect and to have a lower or make their country an easy receptacle for tax evaders. So that said, avoid taxes. How could this should be done? Well, I guess, yeah, I'm describing it would be difficult to do. If you did do it, you would have to do it all at once, obviously. You would have to negotiate it and try to implement it more or less at the same time. It doesn't have to be like this exact same second, but you would have to roll it out all over the world within a pretty set time frame. Otherwise, it'll otherwise some countries will adopt the standardized tax system, and then other countries will drag their feet and reap the benefits from tax evaders. So you'll need some kind of compounded time frame in which the world rolls out the same standardized tax system. I expect it would have to be done, maybe not exactly like that, but something like that. But I'm skeptical it could be done because of that incentive problem. Again, the more countries that have that standardized system, the greater benefits accrue to the one or two countries that end up defecting and not doing it. And there's a lot of poor countries out there that are desperate that would want to do that, and I don't think that they could really avoid it. Hypothetically, you could have an enforcement mechanism in which you punish countries that defect like that. But then that would involve agreeing to an international punishment mechanism that would, in effect, represent a significant centralization of power in a global institution. And nobody's really comfortable with that because that implies sacrificing sovereignty, basically. The creation of such an authority would inherently threaten the sovereignty of individual nations, and in turn there would be a lot of opposition to that for that reason alone. Not only amongst poorer nations, but amongst countries like the US and powerful nations in general that would not want to be subject to that. So it would be difficult to do. Whether or not it should be done, again, kind of normative. Probably most people would be for fighting tax evasion, but the exact method by which to do it, debatable. I don't know how many countries would even be comfortable with the standardized tax system, because that would imply giving up some autonomy, again, some sovereignty, to make that decision in your own country. So even there would be a problem. But there is some interest. There's not so much an interest in standardizing taxes as there is in fighting tax evasion, and there has been a big movement in that regard over the past 10 years. Europe in particular has been cracking down on tax evaders in Europe. Like, what's the big one? Switzerland has come under a lot of pressure. They've had to make a lot of reforms because of pressure from the European Union. And then I think also some of the really tiny countries like Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Monaco, places like that you never hear about, or that don't hear about much. Those places have also had to kind of calibrate. And also places outside Europe like the Cayman Islands and Mauritius, I think, have also come under pressure, although I don't think they've had to make as many reforms since they're a bit more distant. Well, I guess the Cayman Islands is technically part of Britain, so they faced a lot of pressure to make changes, but Mauritius is not, so I don't think they've made as many reforms. So basically, Europe has moved in that direction, and so places that Europe has a lot of influence over have made reforms in that vein. But the rest of the world has kind of not matched that enthusiasm. So there hasn't been as much traction in fighting tax evasion in other parts of the world. Excuse me. What's your take on humans merging with machines? How long before you think it happens? I have no idea. That's a Kukyo question.
Or a me question.
Go for it.
The trick answer is it already happened.
Oh.
Have you seen the gentleman who was in the Olympics who has artificial legs basically from the knee down?
Oh, was that the guy who shot his girlfriend?
Yeah, I guess gentleman is not the right term to refer to him with. All right, yeah. So he's a bad man, but he can run very fast, is the point that I'm trying to say. And he has artificial legs. So this whole humans emerging with machines, it's already happened. The question is polishing this, and then you wouldn't, you would say, trade machinery for your organic self unless it's going to be a distinct improvement while also preserving who you are in the identity sense, which is kind of tricky, and that raises a lot of questions with enhancing our brains. That's the frontier where it's going to really cause a lot of problems with how we identify as humans. A lot of times people just take for granted, you have an amputee, they get a mechanical arm, it's amazing, it connects to the person's cognition in some way, it monitors electrical activity, and they can control this limb. That's amazing. We're there, basically. The bridge between, can we have mechanical stuff replace human parts? We've done that. It's happened. It's happening now, and we're trying to improve upon it. It's still happening, but it hasn't happened to the point where we're surpassing the human form initially, where we kind of really question what it means to be a person and should we be robots instead. But we're kind of moving in that direction. Part of the difference is you have a lot of rejection problems with certain things, and it's a really difficult process of replacing parts that have been evolved to exist for millions of years with mechanical things. The body doesn't tend to like metal inside of it, so after a time it'll protest and you have to replace it or use something else. So I haven't been super current with this kind of thing, but a lot of times people miss the point of the progress that's already there, and it's usually going to be based on the sense of medical urgency. So it's not like you have as many hobbyist transhumanists who say, I like the idea of being more robotic. I'm going to invest in an artificial leg. Generally, it's going to be because you had a particular injury or you were born with a disability or something. Then you have a doctor kind of manage this sort of thing, as opposed to people choosing, do I want to be more human or more robot? I'm sure there are probably some people out there who are doing that, but it's not a widespread societal thing where people are questioning whether they want to be human or robot at this point. But it's not like it's going to be a switch that's suddenly flipped. We're already moving in that general direction, and we're going to see where it takes us. AI is usually the big scare, more so than the physical side of how robotics would change us physically. Sure, we can run faster, jump higher, but if we're just browsing Reddit, does it really matter?
Yeah. Now, CRISPR modification, that would not count as being a cyborg, right? That's something else.
What is CRISPR?
That's that genetic modification technology they developed. Maybe I'm spelling it wrong.
I would say that it falls under the umbrella of transhumanism.
Okay.
Where it is taking you beyond the default human settings. It's like character customization, basically, where you're boosting your stats at the character creation screen with your genetic modification. There's a movie, maybe someone in the chat can say what the film is, where there are certain people who get genetic modifications and they're just starting out better. And it's the story of this guy who's like doing some... This is the worst description of a movie ever. We had to watch it for school.
Uh-huh.
Gattaca, yes, thank you. That's the one.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's the first movie that I saw that kind of raised that issue of, could you have a privileged class of people who can afford to customize themselves to start out their lives with a distinct edge? The answer is yes, that is a potential problem we could run into. Yeah. The counterpoint is that different from the already very large set of advantages a person can have based on like socioeconomic status and stuff? It just seems like an extension of that.
Yeah.
Where it could widen the gap, but it hasn't yet. Maybe later.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't been following it, so it's kind of a blind spot for me. I need to brush up on my hard science.
Yeah, it's a fun concept. I kind of have the whole wait and see approach that you say a lot with economics and stuff, where there's this certain set of people who are very loud and proud saying that it's going to go a very particular way. And it's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not super convinced yet. A lot of it gets romanticized too, that it's going to be this monumental thing that's going to happen in an instant and the world's going to be in an uproar. And if it is, then all the people who said it was are going to feel very smart for a few moments, and that's great. Proud of them.
Good for them. Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the Soviet Union collapsing. There was a lot of people, well, most people kind of didn't see it coming, basically. It was kind of a surprise. Like, having a global superpower just sort of implode was not predicted by the vast majority of people. But from day one of the Soviet Union's existence, there was a cohort of people who were saying it was doomed to failure and it's going to collapse. And they just said it constantly. Every year. Every year they said, this is it. It's almost done. This can't last for much longer. And then finally, in the late 80s, early 90s, they were finally right. And so then they were like, oh, hey, I called it.
Told you so. There was a really cool map that was posted to, I think, one of the maps or data subreddits or something with regard to the different ethnic groups in the Soviet Union and just kind of plotting them out on the map of the territory that the Soviet Union commanded. It's a very, very diverse and different set of people that were a part of that. And the thing that jumped out at me there was they've got to have a lot of extremely different cultural norms and goals and life rhythms and all this. And if you want to have a cohesive entity of a nation, a state, you want them to be not necessarily on the same page, but at least working from the same book. Yeah. And that's part of why you could say the collapse of the Soviet Union was kind of inevitable, was it was such a large territory with such a vastly different set of people that it's not really possible to get them all on board for certain stuff, unless they're in a crisis situation like World War II. That seemed like the exceptional moment that allowed this very vast territory to kind of rally together to do stuff.
Well, there was some legitimacy to the government after the revolution. They had maybe 10, 20 really good years. Yeah, well, maybe 30. Through the 20s, the 30s, 40s was obvious. And then maybe a bit into the 50s. It wasn't really until the 60s, 70s that the stagnation really started to hit. But before that, there was enough revolutionary fervor to kind of power through some of the worst periods. Obviously, that's not a distinction that matters if you're a kulak, but, well, that's just kind of how it worked out.
What does that mean? I don't know what that word is.
Kulak is like a wealthy peasant, basically. And the wealthy peasants in the Soviet Union were some of the principal opponents of collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s, I think it was. And of course, the Stalinist government in power at the time did not generally respond well to dissent. So their response was a quote-unquote dekulakization campaign, which is sort of the politically correct way of saying kill the kulaks. So a lot of people kind of were murdered, killed, tortured, etc. during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, obviously.
They knock on your door and say, would you prefer to be murdered or killed? It's like, well...
Choices. Don't ever tell you that you don't get choices in communism. That's a joke.
Yeah.
So relax. Whoever you are, relax. It's just a joke. But yeah, 20s, 30s, 40s. That was kind of the period when there was still revolutionary fervor that kind of powered the government's supporters through its worst excesses. And it wasn't really until the economy started stagnating that those people started to kind of, not turn on the government, but kind of lose faith. You know, the argument had always been, we're going to build communism in the future. We're laying the foundation now, and then we're going to get it later. And then later kind of never really came. And then people kind of lost faith that it was ever going to come, and that's when you really get the 70s, 80s stagnation. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of different factors involved. But, just roughly, that was one of them. Not sure how I got it. Anyway, that'll be a subject for a 10-minute future podcast video. As you recommended, Neuro. That's a good topic to pick.
Soviet Union in 10 minutes or less, go.
Go. Did we stop taking questions? Or?
Yes, we did, so we can get to some Pacific Theater.
Gotcha. How are we doing on time?
Let's say we go for an hour to an hour and a half.
All right.
Is that good with you?
Works with me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's workable. So let's see.
And to clue people in, I know we have new viewers. It's very nice to have lots of bright minds, and some people just wandered into this expecting just their gameplay. This is a real person I'm talking to. He's my friend. It's not a podcast. He has a podcast. He's working on it. Don't hassle him, please. Thank you. But we're covering the Pacific Theater, which is part of World War II, and it's the part that most people don't talk about. Usually you talk about the fronts in Europe and so forth, in Africa, whereas this is what's happening mostly Japan and USA. And this is the third segment of this, I believe, that we've hit within this, and I tried to summarize it before you came on. The first one, we tried to establish the groundwork leading up to it, and then the second one, we talked about the motivations of the various parties and some of the early game, and then now we're kind of moving beyond the early game, beyond the intention, to more of the interactions. Because we talked about the first few battles, I think, last time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we went through 1942.
Cool. So you've got the year even.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I basically have been kind of roughly have the notes kind of cut up according to year roughly, so that kind of makes for natural segments. Although again, it's I'm flexible as to when you want it cut off, so we don't have to do the whole year, just whenever you feel like. So let's see. I think we had just to kind of start off, there was we've gotten feedback, comments, and whatnot over the course of while we've been doing this, and so some people ask questions or make requests. So one of them was that somebody wanted me to briefly touch on Richard Sorge in Japan. And I think I do remember Richard Sorge, but I hadn't really brought him up just because I was focusing more on this combat side of the Pacific Theater. So Richard Sorge was a German spy, but he was a spy for the Soviet Union. He was a communist, but he was a very convincing spy. He fulfilled a number of roles, infiltrated a number of institutions. He was kind of considered a master spy at the time. And one of his assignments was basically as a German diplomat to Japan. And it was in his capacity as in that role that he figured out that Japan did not intend to attack the Soviet Union in 1941. And it was when that information got back to the Soviet government that they started redeploying their Siberian troops that were stationed in the Soviet Far East in preparation for a possible Japanese attack to Western Europe to help fight the Germans. And contrary to popular belief, it was not the case that those troops were brought over all at once in time to play the decisive role in the battle for Moscow, sort of in the winter of 41. They'd actually already started bringing them over and kind of over the course of the previous couple months. So they'd been trickling in over time, but they ended up playing an important role during the Battle of Moscow. But they didn't like come off the train and then start fighting. They'd kind of already been in place for a while. But yeah, that was an important move because it allowed the Soviet Union to bolster their forces on the Western Front. And they kind of got to bleed those forces for some extra reinforcements there. So that was kind of the importance of Richard Sorge. He allowed the Soviet Union to release strategic assets because they were confident that Japan would honor their non-aggression treaty. So then somebody else wanted me to touch on Indian politics in World War II, or at least in so much as they're relevant to the Pacific Theater. Yeah, I commented on it just a little bit last time. Well, I commented on that there was something I could comment on, but kind of wanted to skip it to save time. Basically, India in the 1930s had seen a big push towards independence. I mean, there had already been an independence movement in India for some decades, but it really took off in the 1920s and 30s. And in the 30s, the British responded by allowing some autonomy. They had elections for a legislature and whatnot. So they were starting to build government and allow the construction of government institutions in colonial India. And there was a lot of debate, suffice to say, within India at the time of what a future independent India would look like. So there was lots of debate between, in particular, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, which kind of emerged sort of in the late 30s as a significant force. As it happened, the Muslim League lost a lot of support in the late 30s, and it ended up getting it back later on when it changed its policy platform to focus more on an independent Pakistan, basically cutting off the Muslim parts of India into its own independent country. That's a whole history unto itself. As it's relevant to World War II, when World War II started, the Indian independence movement was sufficiently strong to make the British think that they could not really use or trust Indian troops. So they still built up the Indian army as part of the war effort, but they didn't really equip it with a lot of significant heavy equipment like tanks, artillery, etc. They did have a fair amount there, but that was mostly British, I think. I think they relegated a lot of the Indian troops to infantry roles. But I think it was something like 1 million men strong. That is to say, the Indian army under the British during World War II. It was pretty sizable, but the British just didn't really trust them enough to really use them a lot. There was definitely some Indian divisions, I think, in the Middle East, Italy, etc., and I think maybe in Burma as well. But most of the army mostly just stayed in India and were set to kind of fight a defensive battle if it came to it. And I think they actually did end up fighting a defensive battle during the brief Japanese invasion of eastern India in 1944, I think, in which they were defeated at the Battle of Imphal and another battle. I think there was two. Imphal was one of them. I don't remember what the other one was. Kohima, I think. Something like that. So the political side of it then is that independence leaders in India were still pushing for independence even during the war. But of course, emergency powers were utilized during the war to kind of keep them quiet. So there was a lot of control of the press. A lot of leaders were detained and put under house arrest. Mahatma Gandhi was famously under house arrest pretty much throughout World War II. So the Indian independence movement kind of was set back a little bit in so much as they couldn't continue the same pace of political activity. But there was still a strong sentiment for independence, and the British didn't think that they could get away with fighting the war and holding on to India without promising them independence. So that promise was issued, but that wasn't enough for some people. There were some Indians who saw the war with Japan as an opportunity to get independence sooner, if not at all, because some of them didn't really trust the British to give it in the first place. So there was actually a number of Indians who ended up joining an army that was created by the Japanese that was comprised entirely of Indians who were nominally fighting for Indian independence. And the core of that army was actually created from people who were former prisoners of war. There was a number of Indian soldiers who had been captured in the fall of Singapore in 1942, sorry. And they were just sort of didn't have anything to do as prisoners of war. And then the Japanese came to them and said, hey, we're going to form an army that is just going to be an Indian army, and we're going to give you the chance to fight the British to free India. And a lot of people, just out of loyalty, said no, but there was a fair number who actually said yes. And there were some defectors from Indian units elsewhere in the region, and also from India itself. I don't think it ever got larger than 60,000, maybe 30,000, somewhere in between there. I don't remember exactly. But it's an interesting bit of history because it kind of reveals that that Pan-Asianism that was a part of Japanese ideology at the time. That was the nominal Japanese rationalization for their effort to build an empire in East Asia. They were going to free Asia and have it be ruled by the Asians. Obviously, the Japanese had a very different definition of Asia for the Asians than the rest of Asia. The rest of Asia was thinking more in terms of autonomy and self-governance. The Japanese were thinking more in terms of
Asia for the Japanese.
For the Japanese, yeah, exactly. But earlier in the war, when the army was formed, and even later on, when they didn't really feel like they had much alternative, they continued to fight for the Japanese against the British, although the Japanese themselves didn't use them all that much. I think they used them maybe once when they were pushing into eastern India, and other than that, I think they mostly just used them for garrison duty and for propaganda purposes. But that was a direct result of politics in India. That push for independence and discontent with British rule directly created a constituency for people who were willing to fight for Japan against the British in World War II. And interestingly, well, I thought it was interesting anyway, a lot of people in India now do not really celebrate the Indian soldiers who fought for Britain in World War II. They don't really consider them heroes per se, because for them it wasn't really their war. And so, they have other heroes and whatnot. But I thought it was interesting that the guy who was the commander, the Indian commander of that Japanese army of Indians, he's actually better remembered. There's actually a lot of Indian nationalists who kind of celebrate him as an expression of Indian independence and the capacity of Indians to kind of fight for their rights. So that guy is actually celebrated, whilst the guys who fought for the Allies are kind of not, or at least not nearly to the same degree. Keep in mind, Indians fighting for the British that's very much a colonial army. So colonial armies, even if they are Indian, were not really perceived very well at the time. So that also played a factor. But that's pretty much what I skipped over last time. That's what I was referencing. When the Japanese were invading Burma and set to push on India, they started kind of building up their army, their Indian army, from prisoners taken at Singapore. And so there was some desire to, one, use them for propaganda to try to get the Indian population to revolt against the British. That would have made an invasion much easier. But also to try to build an army that could have been used in a potential invasion. Or at the very least, garrison duty, which is what it ended up being used mostly. So let's see. Also, correction, Kwangtung Army was specifically located in Manchuria. So the Kwangtung Army was not the name of the Japanese army in China as a whole. It was specifically the name of the army in Manchuria. So I just wanted to clear that up. Let's see. Oh, another correction. At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had 4 carriers, exactly, and they lost all of them. I was a little bit confused when we were talking about it last time. I couldn't remember if they lost 4 and maybe had more, or if it was exact, but it was 4. So let's see, a couple other items here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the debate over air warfare. This is something that predated World War II, but became relevant again during the war. And you kind of saw it in the discussion, the brief outline I gave of the debate between, well, the struggle, really, between General Chennault and General Stilwell, in China, about the best way to fight Japan in China. And the debate basically centered around the power of air power to win a war, the ability of air power to win a war. People in the Army and Navy obviously were pretty skeptical of that. But proponents of air power at that time, and actually still today to a lesser degree, argued that they could win the war by themselves if given enough resources. If they could just bomb the enemy factories, cities, whatnot enough, then the enemy's ability to produce weapons and resources for war would be destroyed, and they wouldn't be able to resist. So that was kind of their perspective: attack industry by the air, and we can shut down the enemy and defeat them that way. It'll be easy to kind of just steamroll them after that once they don't have any ammunition, supplies, etc. Another aspect of that debate was quote-unquote terror bombing, basically. And the idea was don't just bomb their factories and their industrial capacity, but bomb their cities to destroy the morale of their public and turn them against their political leaders. That was another perspective that was proposed at the time. Obviously, the former was more popular than the latter. Bombing civilians was not really considered acceptable at the beginning of World War II. There was a kind of gentleman's agreement that was not a thing that you did to your opponent. And it ended up obviously becoming a big part of the war, but that was kind of by accident in the case of Europe. It was actually, let me see if I can get this right this time. I believe it was a German bomber got lost over London and accidentally bombed London. And then so the British retaliated and bombed Berlin. And so then the Germans completely changed their strategy to focus on bombing London and other major cities.
But did they accidentally bomb Berlin?
No, it was very purposeful in that case. Purposeful retaliation. So that created an escalatory spiral that kind of changed the course of the Battle of Britain. That kind of, the Germans had pretty much been winning. The Royal Air Force was kind of on its back heels at that point and was really struggling to keep up. But the shift in strategy away from focusing on the Royal Air Force to focusing on strategic targets like cities gave the Royal Air Force time to recover and improve. And that kind of saved them in the Battle of Britain. That really helped them quite a bit. But, yeah, that's kind of a tangent, I guess. The point is that strategic bombing in Europe kind of happened by accident on that count. In the case of the Soviet Union, obviously, the Germans had no qualms with bombing cities. And they'd already kind of bombed places like Rotterdam and Warsaw and whatnot. So it's not like it was completely unprecedented. But before that accidental bombing, the British had kind of been refraining from bombing German cities and vice versa. But Germany had already been bombing Soviet cities. They had no problem with that, obviously. And in Asia, Japan had no qualms at all with bombing Chinese cities. They'd already kind of started that. So there was no gentleman's agreement there whatsoever. They bombed them with quite a bit more than just bombs too. In Japan's case, they actually also bombed them, used chemical weapons, And they also used biological weapons, if you can believe that. They actually tried to fill these bombs, I guess you could call them, with infected fleas. They were infected with, I think, some kind of strain of bubonic plague.
Ugh.
And so they actually bombed some targets with those in an effort to try to spread bubonic plague and destroy the opponent's ability to fight through disease, basically. So the Japanese had no qualms with that. They didn't really see the Chinese as equals. So as far as they were concerned, anything went as far as breaking Chinese resistance. Well, regardless, those are examples of strategic bombing in the sense of attacking cities to try to destroy enemy morale, in addition to attacking industry. Industry, of course, is a relatively more legitimate target. But at the time, bombing had kind of mixed accuracy. It was pretty hard to hit specific factories. So even if you are interested just in factories, very difficult to hit them. Well, relatively difficult to hit them. Easier to do during the day as well, but the trouble with day bombing is that you incur a lot of casualties, or at least a lot more casualties. And so the British actually switched pretty early on to night bombing. And the trouble with night bombing is that it's even less accurate than day bombing. So at that point, you're just kind of bombing the city and hoping that you're hitting the factory. The British, to be fair, had a pretty sophisticated system they designed to try to specifically get the bombers to release bombs over the target, the specific part of the city where the factories were, but results were pretty mixed, and there was obviously a lot of collateral damage. The Americans, for their part, decided to do day bombing against the judgment of the British. The British told them, you're going to suffer a lot of casualties, it's not going to be sustainable, and the American response was, shut up, we can do it. And so that resulted in around-the-clock bombing, what was called around-the-clock bombing. The Americans would bomb during the day, and the British would bomb at night. As it happened, the British were right, and the American bombing effort incurred such huge casualties that they ended up suspending bombing for something like 6 months. An extended period of time, anyway, or at least large-scale bombing. And eventually they only started again much later when German air defenses were weaker. Anyway, another tangent. The debate basically centered on bombing industry and bombing cities, and the reason that's relevant to Japan is that we're going to we probably won't get to it today, but strategic bombing of Japan did end up being pretty important. And so that effort focused at the start mostly on industry, but later on kind of spread to just broader destruction of whole cities. That was more the fire bombings. It's also relevant to the war against Japan in so much as it's relevant to China, because again, like I mentioned before, the debate between General Chennault and General Stilwell was very much an Army versus Air Force debate. Chennault believed that the war in China could be best fought by focusing on air power and building up air assets in China and attacking Japanese targets in China, if not Japan itself. General Stilwell wanted to build up the Chinese army and also build up the American army's presence in China and fight the war against Japan more from that direction, in that way. Chennault ended up winning that debate, and so we kind of got a look at what it would look like if the Air Force kind of got its way and tried to win a war by itself to a degree. Obviously, they had the Chinese army's help and, the Chinese Air Force's help, but by and large, the argument that General Chennault made to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese government was that, given enough resources, he could beat Japan, or at least stop their advance. And so that's an interesting case study in what it would look like for the Air Force to kind of embody, well, not embody, what's the word I want? Well, get its way, basically. So let's see, briefly, Kokoda Track campaign we talked about last time in New Guinea. I thought something I did not mention last time is that the Kokoda Track campaign, specifically the offensive by the Japanese to push over and through the Kokoda Track and take Port Moresby. The Japanese were actually outside Port Moresby. They were basically on a hill and could see Port Moresby from the hill and were set to continue the offensive, but then the offensive was canceled because of events on Guadalcanal. So that's not to take away from what the Australian army did. The Australian army fought a pitched battle, and it's debatable whether or not the Japanese could have taken Port Moresby even if they'd gone forward, because their supply chain was so elongated, basically across a mountain, and they were also pretty exhausted by that point. But regardless, the Japanese basically just canceled it and forced everybody to turn back because they needed the troops to help in the fight in the Battle of Guadalcanal. So I thought that was some interesting trivia. The Japanese were within sight of their target, but had to turn around there right at the end. So let's see, and then two more. Japanese radar. I argued that, I didn't argue, but I said that Japan was the only major power in World War II that did not have radar. That's basically true, but a little further research, they did have some, but it was very rudimentary and experimental. It was not fully developed, and it was not widely deployed. So, for example, they had a rudimentary air warning radar at Guadalcanal. They also had some flak radar at the end of the war. But in general, they were in the process of developing it, but pretty much everything that they deployed in the war was experimental, kind of a prototype rather than anything mass-produced. So the last point is something called the May incident, and this is just sort of some interesting trivia. So during a press conference in 1943, a House rep, this is American, the U.S. House of Representatives, there was a House rep named Andrew May, who accidentally revealed that U.S. subs had a relatively high survival rate in the war because Japanese depth charges were being set off too shallow. And casualties later went up later, supposedly because Japan started setting their depth charges to go off at a deeper depth. Now, a Navy report after the war found that it was not necessarily his fault. Basically, they couldn't prove that the casualties went up because specifically of his statement. But it turned into kind of a big scandal in the U.S. because he kind of did that. So it's called the May incident, and I just thought it was some interesting trivia. Somebody basically ran his mouth and kind of gave away a war secret that he wasn't supposed to. So with that said, we can kind of dig into 1943. My notes open here. Yeah. So when we left off last time at the end of 1942, the Allies were still pretty much on the defensive, but they had launched a limited offensive targeting the major Japanese base at Rabaul on the island of, I believe, New Britain. And so that effort involved the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Kokoda Track campaign, and then later in the year, kind of at the end, the Ganabuna campaign, in which the Japanese base of operations at the eastern tip of New Guinea was successfully taken. Also, by that point, Guadalcanal had pretty much been cleared out. So a successful effort to stop the attempt by the Japanese to expand the outer ring of their conquests, that had already kind of happened at the Battle of Midway in the Central Pacific. It took a little bit longer in the South Pacific for the Battle of Guadalcanal and New Guinea to kind of play out there. But it did end successfully. And the Japanese basically from that point on were more or less on the defensive. At the end of 1942, the balance of forces was relatively more even. The Japanese were still pretty strong. The Allies did not feel they had enough resources to spare for the Pacific theater to really invest a lot in major operations in 42. And so the plan was to play defense, but some offense was launched, again, targeting Rabaul, and to try to stop the Japanese advance through Guinea and Guadalcanal. All told, some progress was made in that regard as far as Rabaul. Again, successfully stopping the Japanese in New Guinea and Guadalcanal, but progress was so slow in New Guinea that they basically had to change the timetable. So they didn't make nearly as much progress in 42 as they'd kind of wanted. But again, overall, the strategic direction of the war had shifted in favor of the Allies. And over the course of 1943, as we'll kind of see, the material advantage and numerical advantage of the Allies really starts to become more and more apparent as they start doing more things, basically. It's not just sitting and trying to launch a limited offensive in the South Pacific and hoping for the best. It's more a concerted series of offensives to try to roll back the Japanese empire. But we'll get to that in a bit. For now, one of the things that happens in early 1943 here is a big change in plans. Like I said, U.S. resources had been too weak in theater to really decisively push the Japanese out of the Solomon Islands and the Huon Peninsula. So that ended up getting pushed back. The new plan would involve what was called island hopping. And this is the crux of what came to be called Operation Cartwheel. And the idea of island hopping is that instead of taking every island that the Japanese are occupying, you're just going to take the most strategic islands and isolate the other ones and leave those Japanese units to basically starve. Or at least take them out of the battle anyway. Without naval support, you can't move them around. So they're just sort of stuck there. So that was the idea behind island hopping and Operation Cartwheel. And the plan, the strategic objective, would be to move up to island hop up the Solomon Islands chain towards New Britain, where again Rabaul was. And meanwhile, while the Marine Corps and Navy were doing that, the U.S. Army and the Australian Army on New Guinea would push up from Ganabuna and take the major Japanese base on the Huon Peninsula around the two towns of Salamaua and Lae. Now again, just to reiterate something we talked a little bit about last time, when the Japanese invaded New Guinea, they didn't just take all of it. They stuck to the northern coast because the infrastructure was terrible. And so they basically picked specific spots on the coast to take, towns, strategic locations, and then hopscotched along the coast from west to east towards the east coast of New Guinea, whereupon they tried to move around the tip of New Guinea and invade Port Moresby. And we talked about how that effort failed over the course of the Battle of Coral Sea, the Kokoda Track campaign, and the later Allied counteroffensive in the Ganabuna campaign. So at this point, the Japanese are very much playing defense. They don't really have the resources to really launch another major offensive in theater. So they're just going to try to turtle as much as possible and make the fighting as gruesome and expensive as possible to try to get the Allies to come to some kind of peace negotiation. But that was the crux of the strategy at the time for Japan and for the Allies again. Island hop up the Solomon chain and then launch target specifically that Japanese base on the Huon Peninsula. Oh, I got sidetracked, didn't I? So the Japanese positions in Guinea on the northern coast were just isolated, basically bases that are sort of scattered along that northern coast. Ganabuna was one. They took that, so the next objective was Salamaua Lae. That was the next base, basically, that they were going to try to target. And once they took that, the plan was then to invade the island of New Britain and take Rabaul from the east and west, basically. So that's the new plan. That's kind of what they're thinking of going through the early part of 1943. Something else that happens in 43, the official end of fighting in Ganabuna and in Guadalcanal. Technically, there had still been some going on, but most of the major combat had ended by that point. So it was pretty much just mopping up at that juncture. So that's over. The battles of Guadalcanal and Ganabuna are officially over at this point in early 1943. So at this juncture, the U.S. Marine Corps is kind of building up, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. For those who don't know, the U.S. Marine Corps is actually a part of the U.S. Navy. It's kind of a sub-department. They don't like talking about that because the Marine Corps has a very high opinion of itself. And technically, it's its own branch right now. It's basically treated as its own independent branch of the military, even though organizationally it's technically part of the Navy. So the Navy and Marine Corps kind of go hand in hand in World War II in that regard. So when the Marine Corps does something, the Navy is generally also inherently involved. The U.S. Army kind of had its own thing going on, and there was a lot of tension between the Navy and Army over objectives, goals, whatnot, coordination. The idea of a joint force, a joint command structure, was still pretty new at that time. It was still something they were kind of working out. Anyway, the Navy and Marine Corps would start building up in early 1943 for the island hopping campaign, but they wouldn't actually start it until a bit later. So it would still be a couple months. So as a result, most of the fighting in early 43 in the Pacific would be focused more on the island of New Guinea. And so that's where I'll kind of start here. The Japanese at Salamaua Lae knew that an offensive was coming, so they wanted to try to fortify as much as possible, which they did. But one of the things they also wanted to do was take a nearby airfield at a place called Wau. And Wau is a very tiny outpost, very high in the mountains of New Guinea, relatively close to Salamaua Lae. But the Japanese had not bothered to take it up to that point because the Allies, I don't think, had really been using it that much. But in anticipation of the new Allied offensive targeting them, they wanted to try to take it so that the Allies would not be able to use it as a jumping off point to project air power and also to transport supplies. Now, because it was only accessible by air, it had traditionally been only accessible by air, there was no really good road or track to take. So the Japanese basically just had to rough it through the jungle on their way there. And so because of that, they were discovered basically ahead of time. So the small Australian force there, once they found out that the Japanese were coming, radioed basically an emergency call for help, for reinforcements, because they didn't have nearly enough to defend that position from the large Japanese force that was dispatched against them. So then there was a race there was a race between the Japanese troops on the ground trying to get there before reinforcements could happen, and then on the part of the Allies to try to muster enough troops to basically have a sizable defensive force. And not only that, but to get them there, because again, it's very isolated, and resources were still relatively limited at this point. That Allied advantage in material goods and numbers still kind of in its early stages. They're still trying to scale up industry and leverage that industrial advantage. So as it was, the Allies won that race, and they were able to reinforce WoW in time. And there was a pitched battle between the local defenders and the Japanese, and the early, basically, vanguard of the Japanese advance. And the Australians there defending briefly had to basically defend against that Japanese force by themselves. Reinforcements arrived basically in the nick of time. They basically ran off the plains right into the thick of things. So it was a very tough battle. It was very close, but it was a victory for the Allies, and it forced the Japanese back. So that was an early big victory for the Salamoa-Lae campaign right off the start. Now, the Japanese actually planned to attack Wau again, but they had to cancel it, and that was because of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And that was not so much a naval battle so much as an air raid, basically. Carrier-launched aircraft attacked a Japanese convoy, and they destroyed a large number of transport ships. And as a result, a lot of reinforcements that had been slated to take part in the new Wau offensive were killed or diverted to other places to try it, because it was thought too dangerous to continue on to New Guinea. So out of the 6,900 Japanese troops that had originally been slated to go to New Guinea, only about 1,200 actually made it to Lae. So a much smaller reinforcement than they'd been expecting, and it forced them to call off that offensive. So from there, that leads directly into the actual Salamoa-Lae campaign itself. And it was a tough campaign, because again, the Japanese had had lots of times to fortify, and the Australian and especially the American troops were very green. Not so much, actually I should rescind that. The Australian troops were pretty experienced by that point. These were a lot of the same guys that had fought in Ganabuna and the Kokoda Track, but the American troops, the US Army troops, were mostly new. They hadn't really fought much before, and so they had a hard time of getting through the Japanese fortifications, and in particular with jungle fighting, which was still pretty alien at the time.
If I can interject real fast, we just got a host from a Russian streamer, inmate, Добро пожаловать. I'm trying to work on saying welcome in Russian. We are talking about the Pacific Theater, World War II. I have a real-life guest. This is not a podcast, but this will be on YouTube. This is episode 3 of Pacific Theater. I believe it's episode 52 of Agent Smith discussion. So I'm playing StarCraft. He's telling us about World War II stuff. Usually we talk about Europe in World War II, but we're focusing here on the story of what happened in the Pacific Theater. So US, Japan, but today we also touched on India and stuff, which is cool.
Yeah, little brief coverage there, just for that guy who asked for it. Hopefully that was satisfactory for him, if he's still listening.
Well, there's a reason it's called a world war.
It covered a good chunk. It definitely covered a good chunk. So let's see, Salamoa-Lae. Terrible losses, partly because of inexperience by U.S. Army troops. Part of the problem, also, is that U.S. commanders were trying to rush the offensive, specifically MacArthur, and that resulted in a number of mass infantry attacks on fixed fortifications. And that had the predictable outcome of creating much higher casualties than had been originally planned or desired. So it ended up being a pretty bloody campaign. The Allies still ended up winning. The Japanese were pretty isolated there. They didn't get the reinforcements they needed, like I said, from the Battle of Bismarck Sea. And the Japanese Navy and Air Force had a limited capacity to reinforce at that juncture. So for the battle itself, basically it involved an Australian force moving on Salamoa and trying to force the Japanese to redistribute their forces in that direction, while U.S. paratroopers were launched around Lae. So basically the Australians were the distraction, while U.S. paratroopers surprised the Japanese and caught them off guard from a different direction. Didn't change the fact that the battle was bloody, but that's how technically the battle played out. Now, mind you, this campaign was long and drugged out. It was a couple months. It was not just one and done. So this campaign would see fighting in around the two towns of Salamoa and Lae, and then in around the immediate area. It was, again, pretty tough. It's not one of the more well-known campaigns in the war, I think. Again, I think with a quick summary of Pacific Theater in World War II, generally hit on Pearl Harbor, Midway, Coral Sea, and then maybe you skip. Well, maybe you do the Philippines, maybe you don't, but generally always it ends with Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then the nuclear bombing. So not a lot of people talk about New Guinea, so I've kind of gone out of my way to try to focus a little more on it, to try to illustrate what was going on and whatnot. So that was Salomo Alei. The Japanese would respond with Operation Ego. So this was, it might be pronounced Igo, I don't know. I'm not sure on the pronunciation, so I apologize in advance. But that said, the Japanese Air Force basically launched a counteroffensive in which they tried to strike U.S. Navy targets, U.S. logistics, U.S. bases, basically anything and everything they could get to from their base in New Britain, the island of New Britain, and Rabaul. And they did some damage, but for the most part, it was disaster. Well, maybe not a complete disaster, but they took pretty significant losses, and they were not losses that they could easily replace. Because to reiterate something we talked about last time, Japanese pilots had a very long training cycle. It took a long time to train them. And so losing a pilot for Japan hurt a lot more than the U.S. losing a pilot, because the U.S. training program was pretty quick. It was quality. It was good. It was a good training program in the U.S., but they didn't drag it out nearly as much. They didn't expect nearly as much from their pilot trainees. So on the one hand, Japan was able to do some damage, although it wasn't significant, with its Operation Ego. The outcome was more deleterious for them because they lost a lot of experienced pilots that they couldn't really afford to replace. They could afford to replace the planes. The plane production was decent enough to eat up the losses, but experienced pilots, that's not something you can produce in a factory. So that really hurt them. You kind of saw that with the Battle of Britain, to kind of go back to that. One of the reasons the Royal Air Force was really getting hammered and losing the Battle of Britain was because they just couldn't keep up with the human casualties. They could replace the planes. Production was good enough for that, but they were losing so many pilots that they were having trouble keeping enough planes in the air to fight off the invasion, or the attempt at an invasion. So similarly here, Japan took heavy losses to their pilots that they just couldn't afford to replace. So that was Operation Ego. So that pretty much covers roughly the first couple months of 1943. So that kind of takes us into the spring and summer of 1943. So at this point, there's another change in plans. And it's decided at this point that Rabaul doesn't actually have to be taken. And this is kind of an extension of the island hopping logic. There's a huge garrison at Rabaul. The Japanese garrison is something like 60 to 100,000 troops strong. And given how hard the fighting was at Guadalcanal with a fraction of that number of Japanese troops, it was expected that fighting on New Britain would be pretty gory. But the new strategy was, why take it at all? Let's just bypass it. Let's just isolate the whole garrison. And that was becoming more feasible now because of that material advantage. Again, by now, there's more material with which the Allies can work with. And so the prospect of setting up a cordon of bases, air patrols, and submarine patrols around garrisons is more feasible now than it was before, when there wasn't really the resources to do that. So the plan now is to isolate Rabaul rather than take it. There is a plan to land on the western tip of the island of New Britain. That's not anywhere close to the actual base at Rabaul, but the idea is that they wanted to secure the straits between the western tip of the island of New Britain and New Guinea. And the reason was that would have been a natural choke point for the Japanese to pressure, because it was expected that a lot of U.S. and Allied supply ships would come through that strait. So securing the western tip of the island was considered necessary. But the rest of the island, it was planned, would be left alone. It would be purely a defensive battle at that point for the U.S. That was the plan. We haven't gotten to the actual battle yet. So this is also where the island hopping strategy is officially adopted. This is officially the plan. We already kind of talked about that. To talk a little more about the isolated garrisons on islands, to talk a little bit more about isolated garrisons, they had a pretty tough experience through the rest of the war. So in places like the island of New Britain, or some of the larger islands, Formosa was actually isolated late in the war, and some of the larger islands in the Caroline Islands, places like that actually allowed for some agriculture. And there was a lot of peasants in the Japanese army who had a background with agriculture, so they were able to actually till the land and generate enough food to live on. Now, that was in conjunction with fishing, which a lot of Japanese isolated garrisons also did. So they had some produce and then fish as well to kind of sustain their diet. So those garrisons would do relatively well. Some garrisons, though, did not have the benefit of tillable land or a lot of fish to work with. And those were the ones that saw a lot of starvation. There were some garrisons that were several thousand strong that by the end of the war only had a couple hundred left. And there are some pretty gory stories about cannibalism of Allied POWs, eating anything and everything on the island. On Wake Island, the garrison actually wiped out a unique species of flightless bird that could only be found on Wake Island, and they basically just ate all of them because there was nothing else to eat. Fish populations also were not infinite. There were some lagoons where they fished so much that they literally just wiped out the fish populations there. So even that was not necessarily sustainable if you had too many people in too small a place. So pretty tough existence. And over the course of the war, about 100,000 some Japanese troops would be bypassed like this and left to their own devices, basically, knocked out of the war without having a fight. Pretty ideal way to knock out a lot of troops for the Allies, but for the Japanese it really hurt. Because again, a big part of their strategy was trying to force the Allies to incur as many casualties as possible to try to get them to give up the war, to basically give it up as being too expensive, too difficult, and try to bring them to the peace negotiations. So all of these garrisons were set to battle to the death, basically, and then instead they just sort of were left to do nothing. Kind of counter anticlimactic for them, an early end of the war, if you will. So let's see. Also, as part of the strategy negotiations going on in the US, there was a debate between the Navy and the Army over a Central versus South Pacific strategy. So this is something else that's negotiated at this point. Before, the plan was pretty much take Rabaul, but later on it was changed to bypass Rabaul. But then what about strategy beyond that point? How are we actually going to defeat Japan? So it's now that they really kind of have to decide between a Central versus South Pacific strategy. Now, the Navy supported the Central Pacific strategy, which basically would have involved moving through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and then skipping over to the Mariana Islands, and then skipping over to Formosa, and then using Formosa. Formosa, by the way, for those who don't know, that's Taiwan. That's what they used to call Taiwan back in the day. So the plan would have been to use Taiwan as a jumping off point to invade Japan. So that invasion route would have taken the Navy through the Central Pacific, most of the major island chains in the Pacific, including the major Japanese naval base at the island of Truk. Actually, I guess it's an atoll, technically, the Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. And so the rest of the Japanese Empire and the Philippines, all the other occupied territory, that pretty much would have been left alone, and the focus put squarely on Japan itself. Now, the U.S. Army, in contrast, wanted a South Pacific plan. They wanted to take the rest of Guinea, liberate the rest of it, and then from Guinea, skip directly to the Philippines, liberate the Philippines, and then from the Philippines, move on Formosa, and then from Formosa on to Japan. Both plans end with Formosa, basically, but they had very different routes to go through to try to take it. And ultimately, the decision of the U.S. government was just to do both. They would split resources between the Army and the Navy and allow them to pursue both objectives at the same time. Partly that was out of recognition of the industrial advantage the Allies had. Again, they were still scaling up in early 1943, but it was presumed that by the time the offensives really got started, that they would have enough material to kind of do both. Not necessarily do both particularly well or as fast as they might have otherwise, but the point was not to do it fast. The point was to stretch the Japanese military thin. That was the attraction of doing both. You would force the Japanese to basically choose between fighting the Navy push in the Central Pacific or fighting the Army push in the South Pacific, on the presumption that they would not really have the resources to fight both at the same time, which basically ended up being true. It's debatable whether or not they would have even really had resources to fight one of them at the same time. But by spreading the Japanese forces around even further, it really forced them into an impossible dilemma. And so, for that reason, they went with both, pretty much. That's my understanding, anyway. I welcome criticism on that point. So, still in spring-summer 43 here, what about actual battles? So the big battle that kind of the big new battle here that opens up is the official initiation of Operation Cartwheel, and that's the invasion of the island of New Georgia. And this happens in June 43. So New Georgia, kind of like, they actually do take, I think, all of New Georgia, don't they? But the fighting is pretty tough, extended. It's typical Japanese fight to the death style, banzai charges, etc. But over the course of a couple months, they eventually do take it successfully. So let's see, that's New Georgia. And then at the same time, they're still fighting in Guinea related to the Salamau Lehi campaign. I think it's pretty much wrapping up at this point. by spring-summer 43. So this is pretty much what the fighting looks like. It's fighting on the island of New Georgia and the Solomon Islands. That's Navy, Marine Corps. And then on New Guinea, finishing the Salamaua campaign. That's U.S. Army, Australia Army. Now, also in this period is a lesser-known battle. So this is something for you people that are maybe more familiar with the Pacific theater. The Battle of Attu. So for those of you who were here last time, and maybe for some of you who weren't, you may remember that as part of the Battle of Midway, or more accurately, as part of the Japanese plan to take Midway before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese tried to launch a distraction, tried to use a distraction, that being the invasion of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And the two islands they took were Attu and Kiska. Now, the distraction didn't work because the U.S. Navy had cracked the Japanese naval code and they knew that the Japanese were planning an attack on Midway. But after the Battle of Midway, there was no attempt to retake the islands of Attu and Kiska from the Japanese. And the Japanese did have a garrison there, so they were holding on to them. So for a number of months then, after the Battle of Midway, in fact, probably roughly 8 to 10 months roughly, the Allies pretty much just bombed the garrison occasionally using bombers stationed in Alaska, and occasionally bombed the Japanese-held Kuril Islands. But mostly I think they were focusing on Attu and Kiska. But other than that, they pretty much just left them alone until now. So here in the spring-summer 43, the U.S. specifically decides it wants to take back the island, take back both islands. And it's interesting, well, it's interesting trivia in general, because again, these were the only islands, the only actual U.S. territory that Japan was able to take in the war. Because again, the islands are technically Alaska. But it's also interesting because I think the mental image most people have, at least those familiar with the Pacific War, of the U.S. and Japan fighting over islands is tropical islands. You imagine them fighting over these tropical islands with, palm trees and all that stuff. But actually, there was one example where they fought in a very icy, cold tundra environment, that being Attu and Kiska, because this is way up north, remember. So this is the one example where you can actually see Japanese Marines and U.S. Marines and Japanese forces fighting in a very different climate from that which was common in the rest of the war. So the Battle of Attu then happened. The U.S. invades, again, spring, summer 43, and it actually goes relatively well in terms of the actual combat. Japanese forces pretty much fight to the death, again, no surprise. Relatively few prisoners. Eventually they do evacuate, though. There was some evacuation, so it wasn't like Iwo Jima later on, where it's do or die, and they fight very hard, but then when it's clear they're losing the battle, they kind of retreat. So Attu is taken that way. Most of the casualties, though, there was a lot of casualties, and most of the casualties actually came from the weather. They were not really well prepared to be fighting in weather that cold, and so there was a number of casualties, several thousand, I think, that actually just stemmed from frostbite and other weather-related issues. So one of the lesser-known battles of World War II there, for your interest. If you're curious what happened with the island of Kiska, the other island that was occupied, the Japanese actually evacuated it completely before the invasion, so the Allies were able to take that back without a fight. So thus Attu and Kiska were reconquered in 1943. Now, there's an interesting sort of postscript to this. Once the U.S. had retaken the islands, there was then a question of what to do with the bombers that they had up in Alaska still. And so it was decided that they would continue raiding Japanese targets, but this time they would focus on the Kuril Islands. And if you don't know what the Kuril Islands are, you probably do if you're Russian. Welcome Russian viewers. I know we got the host recently. So the Kuril Islands are the islands north of the main Japanese islands. There's a chain of them that runs between the northern island of Hokkaido and the eastern Russian territory. I think it's Kamchatka or something. So those islands at that time were Japanese, and the U.S. started to bomb them, basically. And that kind of marked technically the beginning of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Although at that point there weren't really any strategic targets in the Kuril Islands to hit. It was more about harassment. But the campaign actually did have some importance. Not really at this juncture, but it would later on as the bombings continued. And the importance stemmed from the fact, and we talked about this last time too, the shortest distance between Japan and the United States runs astride Alaska. So, if you look at a flat map, you might think it runs through the central Pacific. It doesn't. Because of curvature of the Earth, the fastest, shortest way to get to the United States from Japan is to go northeast of Japan, skirt eastern Russia, skirt Alaska, come down western Canada, and then you'll hit the northwestern U.S. Technically, that's the shortest distance. So by continuing to pressure the Kuril Islands in northern Japan, the Japanese commanders, generals, Japanese government, I should say, constantly had to keep in mind that maybe the Allies could launch an invasion of northern Japan from that route. So by constantly having that harassment there, they were constantly reminded of that fact, and they had to station some forces there to hedge against a possible attack. Even if it was only light raiding, as it was at this time, it still constituted a technical threat. So at any time, that raiding could have picked up, and the Japanese had to make sure they had enough troops and planes, specifically planes, to defend against a potential lightning thrust from Alaska by the U.S. So that did tie down some troops, not so much in 43, but it would actually tie down a good number later on, which was helpful to forces fighting elsewhere in the rest of the Pacific. So that's a quick snapshot of the northern Pacific part of the Pacific theater, which I don't think hardly gets any attention, since almost all of the fighting was Central Pacific and South Pacific. But the North Pacific was more sensitive than you might think, specifically because of that distance factor. The fact that a quick invasion force hypothetically could have traveled from the northwestern U.S. to northern Japan and maybe launched some kind of series of raids or even a light invasion of some kind. And so that made it disproportionately important, given the lack of actual strategic assets in the region. There wasn't hardly any people, cities, natural resources, etc. So you might not think it was that important, but just for that distance reason, it was actually more in the minds of commanders at the time, although South Pacific and Central Pacific were still the most important. So that said, that takes us into late 1943. So at this point, just a second. Sorry. So at this point, there's an expansion in the fighting on New Guinea. So the Salamoa-Lae campaign has wrapped up now, but there's still Japanese forces in the area, right? So the immediate area around Salamoa has been pretty much cleared out, but Japanese forces have now retreated into the interior of New Guinea. Now, one force retreated along the coast, and pursuing them is what constituted what came to be known as the Huon Peninsula campaign. And so what would happen is, again, there's not really any infrastructure on New Guinea, so the Japanese forces mostly stuck to the coast. So pursuing Australian forces would pursue them by land, and then American forces would land using amphibious landings behind them. And that, in turn, would force the Japanese to retreat further westward along the coast. So there was a series of battles fought involving a series of amphibious landings, hopscotching across the coast, forcing the Japanese to retreat further and further west, and eventually just into the island's actual interior, the jungle interior. So that was the Huon Peninsula campaign. That lasted a very long time, number of months. At the same time, there was a sort of subset of that Huon Peninsula campaign called the Finisterre Ridge campaign. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. So the Finisterre Ridge campaign refers to the campaign that was fought almost parallel to the coast. One force of Japanese, like I said, retreated from Salamoa-Lae along the coast. Another one retreated into a valley that was in the Finisterre Range, that was basically to the west of Salamoa-Lae. So the Australian force that pursued them fought a running battle with those Japanese forces over the course of several months. And the Japanese eventually were reduced to hit-and-run tactics and setting up impromptu farms in the jungle interior to try to survive off them because they weren't getting relieved, basically. There was no escape. But that turned into a mopping up operation for the Australians that lasted several months, basically. So that's the Finisterre Range campaign and the Huon Peninsula campaign, and all of that kind of starts happening in late 43, sort of in that sort of late summer and autumn period. So at the same time that's happening, Operation Cartwheel continues with the new invasion of the island of Bougainville, and the Bougainville is the largest and most northwesterly island in the Solomon Islands chain. And that island had a very large garrison. It wasn't as large as the New Britain garrison or the Rabaul garrison, but I think it was something like tens of thousands, something like that, something in that range. And the plan on Bougainville was not to seize the island outright. The plan on Bougainville, unlike New Georgia, was basically to take a corner of the island and then just play defense, to tie down the garrison. So the fighting on Bougainville would actually last until the end of the war for that reason. The fighting after the initial invasion was the heaviest part of the fighting on Bougainville. And that's the part of the fighting where the Japanese tried to take the landing area and expel the Allies from the island. And that led to, I think the biggest battle was the Battle of the Perimeter. But after that was defeated, the Japanese kind of resigned themselves to the fact that they would not be able to dislodge the landing. And after that, it was more hit and run attacks, skirmishing, and occasionally maybe a large attack, but nothing was ever able to really come of it. The Allies, meanwhile, would basically just kind of be stuck there, trying to contain the Japanese troops there, acting as the containment force. So Bougainville has been isolated. New Georgia has been taken. That's pretty much where Operation Cartwheel is at this point, although Bougainville, again, fighting would continue for some time. Now, this is all South Pacific stuff. This is sort of the Army's side of things, where they're fighting on Guinea. Marines kind of fighting on Bougainville. That's their side of it. But the Army is fighting mostly, the Australian and U.S. Army is fighting on New Guinea, in Huon Peninsula and Finisterre Range. And South Pacific. So then the Central Pacific theater then really lights up at this point. And it's been quiet for a while. Basically after the Battle of Midway, there wasn't a lot going on in the Central Pacific for the following year. There was some raids and whatnot, some skirmishing, but for the most part, it was not a major site of combat. So now that changes. Now there's enough resources in the Pacific theater to allow for a major offensive. And this is the plan that I was telling you about before, where the South Pacific thrust moves up through Guinea and the Central Pacific thrust moves up through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. So here in late 1943, it's the Gilbert Islands offensive that starts, the Gilbert Islands campaign, rather. And if you don't know where the Gilbert Islands are, that's just a north-south island chain that's northeast of the Solomon Islands. So the U.S. plan is to take 2 islands in the chain. These are the most heavily defended islands, and pretty much the only ones I think that the Japanese have garrisons. And these are, well, I shouldn't say islands, I should technically say atolls. Tarawa Atoll and Makin Atoll. Now, if you don't know what the difference between an island and an atoll is, don't sweat it. Basically, it's a pretty technical difference. An island is, as you imagine, it's an island. Just in your head, picture that. So an atoll basically is what happens when the island sinks under the ocean. So this is a very rough this is a rough description, mind you. I'm not a geologist, so I apologize if I get this wrong, but this is my understanding. So what happens is islands sprout up because of volcanic activity, but eventually the volcanic activity dies down, so then the island actually sinks back beneath the waves. But part of the process of becoming an island in the first place involved the development of coral, big coral reefs around the island. And so even after the island sinks back underneath the water, that coral reef actually stays. And so those coral reefs then can form islands of their own, basically in a circle around where the island was. And the body of water within that circle is called a lagoon, because generally it's a little bit separate from the ocean around it, although it varies from atoll to atoll. So an atoll is basically a collection of coral reef islands around where an island used to be. A fully fledged island, anyway, used to be. Whereas an island is actually, a full land mass with a full interior and whatnot and a coral reef around it. So the Japanese put garrisons on 2 atolls in the Gilbert Islands, and the U.S. plan was to take them as the first part of its offensive in the Central Pacific. So the first of these was the attack on Tarawa, and specifically Beshio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. And it was a bit of a clusterfuck. It was not pretty. It was the first major amphibious assault in the Pacific theater for the U.S. There had already been a lot of fighting by the U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal, but that had been mostly a land fighting. There was not like a amphibious assault that met a lot of resistance at the beach, per se. So one of the problems was there was an ineffective short preliminary bombardment. So a preliminary bombardment, that's just ships basically shooting the hell out of the island before the actual invasion. And generally later in the war, these would last hours, if not days. And they would involve ships, battleships, heavy ships, as well as carrier aircraft bombarding from the air, if not also bombers from land bases. In the case of Tarawa, there was only a short cursory bombardment from capital ships, Navy ships. And it wasn't really enough to do enough damage to really reduce the garrison. So that was one problem. Another problem is that there was a miscalculation as far as the tide. The invasion was planned for high tide, and they had to do that because the Higgins boats would not be able to clear the coral reef without high tide, basically. If you don't know what a Higgins boat is, just imagine the first 5 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. All of those boats with the infantry landing on D-Day, with the big door in front that falls out and then everybody runs out. That's a Higgins boat. That's what they were mostly using at this juncture in the Pacific theater. They had a really shallow draft, but even with a shallow draft, they would not be able to clear the coral without coming in at high tide. But the problem was there was a unaccounted for neap tide, which caused the tide to be lower than expected. And that ended up becoming a problem because then it meant that U.S. Marines had to disembark their Higgins boats about 500 yards from the shore and wade through waist-deep water to get to their intended landing site, during which time they were very vulnerable to Japanese fire, artillery, machine guns, snipers, etc. So
Not to
that was a
mention
big
that it would
problem
be
right there.
tiring.
Sorry,
too.
what?
Not to mention that it would be tiring as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it would have been very exhausting. So it was a pretty big mistake. And, sorry. Yeah, it was a big problem at the start of the campaign. So Higgins boats, they did actually at this point have some LVTs. These are landing vehicle tracked. And these are basically amphibious assault vehicles that have tracks like tanks, but can float in the water if need be, like a boat. So it's a little bit of the best of both worlds, basically. The trouble with the LVTs was that they were relatively expensive to make, and the Allies did not have very many at this juncture in the war. So they were able to land troops on the beach without having them wade through 500 yards of water, but there weren't very many troops that were able to be landed in this fashion. And also the LVTs, a number of them were disabled or destroyed by Japanese fire as they were approaching. And even once they got to the beach, they had a problem because they couldn't actually get past the seawall at the beach. So they ended up getting stuck behind the seawall, unable to really advance. Another problem is that there was only one tank that survived the first battle, the first day, rather, of the war. Sorry, the first day of the battle. And so that meant that there was a lot less armor for the infantry to work with than originally planned. That one tank, incidentally, ended up being pretty important in the subsequent battle. It ended up being basically the vanguard of the American advance. But it was a lot less than they'd originally planned for. The battle would have gone a lot better if they'd had more of their armor intact. So all told, a big mess, as you can infer. So you might wonder then why there was not a concerted Japanese attack on that beachhead after the first day when there was so much confusion and lack of coordination. And the reason is that pretty much all of the Japanese commanders on the island were dead at that point. There just wasn't anybody really left after the bombardment, after the early fighting, etc. And so there was no real ability for the Japanese commanders. There was no capacity to launch a coordinated offensive. Instead, it was basically a bunch of isolated Japanese units fighting by themselves, on their own, independently. So let's see. Also, the Japanese had planned to fight the invasion at the beach. That was their initial plan. And it turned out that was a bad idea, because it meant that once those initial defenses were destroyed, there was nothing to kind of hold the U.S. back. So that was actually one of the big lessons taken away from Tarawa for the Japanese, which is that you should not defend at the beach. It's better to have defense in depth and to kind of spread your defense around the island. This is kind of a reflection of the corresponding debate in land warfare, where you have to defend a river, and you have to decide whether you want to defend at the river or defend a little bit behind the river and attack your opponent as they're trying to cross. Defending at the river, that's nice, because obviously you can kind of gun them down as they're trying to cross. But the disadvantage is that, one, they're going to know you're there, so they could just try to find another location. And two, they can just pound the hell out of you with indirect fire, artillery, air support, etc. Now, on the other hand, having defense in depth and kind of giving them a chance to establish a foothold and attacking as a counterattack to that landing, that saves you the trouble of having a fixed position or having to deal with indirect fire. But the disadvantage is that the opponent has a chance to fortify their beachhead, basically, before you can do anything about it. Their bridgehead, rather. And the Soviets in particular in World War II were known for being able to fortify bridgeheads very quickly. So you really have to get the timing right in order to make that work. But if you can, it's a better way to defend generally than just defending right at the river. So correspondingly, in the Pacific theater, the Japanese figured out that it's better to defend the interior of the island rather than to just defend right at the beach. So that brings us to Makin Atoll. That was the second part of the Gilbert Islands campaign. This one went a little smoother, but it still had some teething troubles. This time, there was a miscalculation about the depth of the lagoon in the interior of the atoll, with the result that once again Higgins boats were unable to clear the coral reef around the island, and Marines had to travel this time 250 yards through the lagoon, through waist-high water to try to reach the beachhead. Planners were also caught off guard by the incapacity of the beaches to support logistics. So that ended up also kind of hobbling them. Another problem is that the U.S. attacked from different directions. So the original plan was to attack on one side of the island and draw in Japanese defenders, and at the same time launch a different force on the opposite side of the island and try to sneak up on them and attack them from the rear, catching them off guard. That plan didn't work because the Japanese, having already learned from Tarawa, had already started reorienting their defense to be defense in depth. So they didn't come out and attack the initial landing, they just sort of waited for them to attack them. With the result that there was no surprise attack from the Japanese rear, and furthermore, the U.S. was kind of unprepared for the difficulty of coordinating two different forces on two different parts of the island. Keep in mind, this is still relatively early in the war, and so a lot of U.S. forces are still kind of learning how to fight, learning by doing, basically. So some of these teething troubles really came out here in the Gilbert Islands campaign. So let's see. Incidentally, most of the casualties from the Battle of Makin actually came not from fighting on the island, but from the sinking of an aircraft carrier. Something like 800 casualties were incurred when the Japanese sub sank a aircraft carrier. I didn't get the name, but that actually comprised the majority of the casualties in the actual Battle of Makin. So if you ever look at the casualties for the Battle of Makin, that's why. It's basically mostly that one carrier. So let's see, that takes us to still in late 43. So the Kuril Islands raids, I already kind of talked about that. But here in late 1943, the raids actually are stopped. And they're actually stopped for about 5 months because the raiding force of 20 bombers during one mission lost about half of its force. About 9 of the 20 were shot down. And that was because Japanese defenses were starting to develop, becoming better and better. And so at that juncture, it was decided to just suspend bombing. They could have kept going, but it would have required more of a commitment, a material commitment to replace those bombers. And it wasn't really thought to be worth the effort at that point. So that bombing campaign over on the Kuril Islands is suspended for the following 5 months as a result of that raid. It would pick up again, and the factors I talked about would still be relevant later on, but for the next bit of the war, not a relevant factor. So let's see, and then to kind of drawing to a close here in 1943 here. So some trivia here, basically. So I basically described all of the major fighting here at the end of 43. So now we're going to get into a little bit of trivia here. One of the weird things about the Pacific War is that a lot of American Lend-Lease, which is to say basically material aid, military aid, whatnot, to the Soviet Union actually traveled through the North Pacific, which you might think, which is a little counterintuitive given that Japan kind of controls the approaches to Russia in that area. So the reason that happened, for one, there were 3 different routes for Lend-Lease. There were 3 main routes. One of them was through the North Sea over Scandinavia. That was a very dangerous route because the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and German commerce raiders, that is to say naval, basically pocket battleships, patrolled that area. So there was a lot of losses to Lend-Lease transports there. But that was one of the routes. Another route was the longest one, which was to go around the Cape of Good Hope under South Africa, sail all the way down there, and then sail back up to Persia, present-day Iran, and unload on ports there, and then have the supplies be taken into the Soviet Union from that direction. That was the safest route, but it was also just very long. The shortest and the safest route was actually the one in the North Pacific. And the reason that is because of Japan's non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union. All of the ships were Soviet flagged. They were not US flagged ships. But the reason that's weird is because Germany and Britain, for their part, had no qualms about attacking neutral flagged ships that they knew were trading with their enemies. In the Germans' case, it was the U-boats, and in the British case, it was the Royal Navy. So they had no problems with that, but Japan did. Now, obviously, they have a good reason for that. Attacking Soviet ships would have broken the non-aggression treaty, and that would have incurred the wrath of the Soviet Union. But it's just one of the quirks of the war, and the fact that that non-aggression treaty existed that Japan ended up being one of the few major powers to not attack neutral shipping. And as a result, a lot of American Lend-Lease was able to go unmolested to the Soviet Union right by a major Axis power. Now, to be fair, incidentally, the Japanese did not allow ships coming through that route to carry weapons. That was one of their caveats. There was some smuggling, but for the most part, Lend-Lease supplies that came through that route were mostly nonviolent. Basically, capital equipment, trains, things like that, non-lethal equipment of some sort or another. And let me check my notes here. And that nominally was enforced. So that is kind of a limiting factor there for Lend-Lease. But in the end, about 50% of Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union from the US ended up coming through that North Pacific route. So it ended up being pretty important. And that was much to the consternation of Germany, which of course was fighting a big war with the Soviets and Europe at the time. They kind of were hoping their Japanese allies might help them a bit more than that, but they did not do so. And that kind of ties into a little bit of what we talked about, I think at the end of last time we were doing this. I talked a bit about how the Germans were pushing the Japanese to attack the Soviets in late 42, corresponding with the Battle of Stalingrad. And the Japanese kind of hedged on that and said, well, maybe if you cross the Volga, but not really clear if they ever would have, even if the Germans had. But as it happened, the Japanese did not invade the Eastern Soviet Union at that time to help out Germany. They had a full plate at the time, fighting in China and fighting in the Pacific with the US and the other allies. So not particularly realistic from their perspective. But here you see another example of how Japan is not helping Germany, not really cutting off that supply route like they might be able to otherwise. So then another thing that, and this is an important aspect of the Pacific theater here, at the end of 43, American submarines really start to become a lot more effective. And up to this point, they had not really been as effective because a couple reasons. One, they had faulty torpedoes. That was a big problem at the beginning of the war for the US. A lot of torpedoes just did not work. They would go too deep in the ocean. That is to say, they would go too deep under their targets. So they'd just kind of sail by without hitting anything. And even in the cases where they were able to hit something, a lot of the warheads were faulty, so they wouldn't actually go off. So that was very debilitating for the US submarine force, as well as destroyers and other ships that were using torpedoes. But in late 43, the issue starts to be addressed, and finally there's decent torpedoes issued. So at that point, the US submarine force is able to significantly increase its effectiveness. Another factor was that the Japanese naval code was cracked. Again, the new Japanese naval code in this case. And so that allowed the US to kind of figure out where Japanese shipping was, where it was going, etc. And with that knowledge, they were better able to create submarine activity to choke off Japan's merchant marine. US subs had helped a bit at Guadalcanal. They had not been completely ineffective up to this point. But you can kind of see in the kill ratio, the ratio of kills to patrols, how much more effective they got with time. And I've got the numbers here. In 1942, there were 350 submarine patrols, US submarine patrols. And of these, from these, 180 ships were sunk. In 1943, though, 350 patrols again, but this time 335 ships sunk. And in 1944, 520 patrols, this time getting 603 ships sunk. So by the end of the war, 1,200 merchant ships, about 5 million tons of shipping had been sunk by Allied submarines and other factors in total. And I think submarines were about half of that, something to that effect. I should also add that part of the reason US subs became more successful was not only changes by the US, but also the fact that the Japanese never really developed a good escort destroyer. Most of their destroyers were heavy destroyers. They were designed for fleet combat, but they were not really cost effective as escorts. If you want an escort, you want a lot of them, and you want them to be relatively cheap because you're going to be making a lot of them. But the Japanese focused on heavy destroyers, and so they're never able to really make as many destroyers as they needed to for escort purposes to try to counter that submarine threat. Also, interesting trivia here, something on the order of 10 to 20,000 Allied POWs were killed because of Allied submarines sinking ships that they were being transported in. And generally, that was an accident. They just didn't know that the transports were carrying POWs, but it's an unfortunate fact of the war that happened. In some cases, though, there was foreknowledge that there was POWs on board ships. But the thing is, POWs were not the only thing on those ships. There was also supplies, equipment, etc. if not also Japanese troops. And so a judgment call was made by the U.S. Navy that it was still worth it to sink those ships in order, for one, to deny those supplies and reinforcements to the Japanese military, but also to make sure that the Japanese did not start using POWs as human shields. If the Japanese know that Allied submarines are still going to sink ships, even if there are POWs on them, then that denies them the option of just stacking all of their ships with POWs. So also an ugly aspect of the war. So then at the very end of 1943 in December, Operation Cartwheel continued with the actual invasion of New Britain. And again, they only invaded and occupied the western tip of the island. Again, the plan was just to occupy that western tip to secure the strait to the west of it, and to act as a part of the containment force that was being created around the island. A whole part of the operation involved occupying small islands around New Britain and setting up air bases on which air attacks on the Rabaul base and the troops there could be launched, and that could operate as bases and for submarines and whatnot. I think mostly air power, but submarines also patrolled around isolated garrisons to make sure that any Japanese attempt to relieve them or reinforce them be met with a sub raid, basically, submarine torpedoes. So that's 1943. How are we doing on time?
Sorry, I'm muted. 15-minute warning is good. Some closing thoughts, perhaps.
Gotcha.
I've been live for 10 hours and 2 minutes now.
So I'll save 1944 for next time then.
All right.
Because that'll take a while. Kind of a natural stopping point, if that's okay with you.
Yep, sounds good to me.
Let's see, there's still plenty more to get to. So hopefully this series is kind of gives people something to chew on. Hopefully people not familiar with the Pacific Theater, that kind of gives them an introduction, and maybe has some interesting trivia for those who are more familiar with it, and for whom a lot of this might be old hat, an old topic of discussion. Again, if there's any... Sorry, go ahead.
The thing that I was imagining through a lot of this is seeing some of these battles unfold on some StarCraft custom maps, where you can kind of set the stats of these different Allied and Axis subs and ships and planes and soldiers and stuff, and you build the map, because we know where the battles were, and you could basically put an equivalent in a game. Be pretty fun. I think for some people it would work better as a learning tool than either reading or listening, to kind of play it out and see the attacks happen and stuff like that.
Yeah. Fair point. So let's see, if we've got a little bit of time left, then I can kind of touch on some other things here.
Someone's saying, is this a map maker challenge? Well, I guess it is now.
Yeah, go for it. Let's see. So I don't know if you've heard of this, Neuro. It's the North Korean embassy in Spain was raided recently. Have you heard anything about that?
Nope.
You're going to love this then. Okay, so what happened was the embassy was invaded and attacked by a team of people whom entered the embassy by force and tied up all of the occupants inside and basically ransacked it. They started stealing computer equipment, papers, just kind of whatever they could get.
Is this a movie or is this the news?
This is the news.
Okay.
It actually happened. So as it happened, one of the women who had been tied up inside the embassy escaped through a window. She got out of her constraints and called the police. So the police came, and they actually came while the people who had raided the place were still there. So one of them came out and pretended to be an embassy worker and told them that everything is fine. There aren't any problems here. And then as he was doing that, after he did that, he walked back inside, and then they all jumped into I think it was a diplomatic car for the embassy, and then all ran off with all the stuff that they'd taken. So after that, the Spanish authorities, of course, had to investigate, because that's a pretty clear breach of protocol. And what they found is that a couple of the guys that were found to have been related to it had connections to the CIA. But we don't really know how substantial those connections are and whether they had anything to do with the raid itself, or even what the raid was meant to do or accomplish. It was clearly a bold move, and it's a serious breach, again, of diplomatic protocol to do that. They're not supposed to just break into somebody's embassy and steal information. But apparently somebody thought it would be a good idea.
But what if it's very urgent?
It's funny you mentioned that. Because that was actually nominally the excuse that was given. Because what came out later was that the group involved actually contacted the media to try to justify their action. And they said, quote unquote, they were responding to an urgent situation in the Madrid embassy. These were sort of their direct words. Responded to an urgent situation in the Madrid embassy. And the judge overseeing the case said that they had identified themselves as a human rights movement seeking to liberate North Korea, quote unquote. And, obviously that's a big crime, so the Spanish authorities are after them, but it seems like most of the people involved have fled Spain at this point. But it's based off of it's based off of their contact with the media, and apparently their contact with the police, that people kind of have inferred who they are and what they're doing. And apparently they themselves were not planning on their identity being revealed. They had apparently asked the media not to reveal who they were. They apparently called themselves the Chiolima Civil Defense. I'm not probably butchering the pronunciation of that, but that's sort of their group's name. And apparently it's some kind of human rights group fighting against the North Korean regime. Now, apparently something else that they did is they apparently went to the FBI in the US and turned over all of the stuff that they stole. So apparently all of that is now in the hands of the FBI. It's a very bizarre case. It's hypothetically, I guess it could be a CIA operation to steal information that they think they need. But if so, it was a very ham-fisted one. I mean, if you're going to do that, you're not supposed to get caught. It's pretty clear that they got caught here.
Yeah, well, you said they didn't expect to be revealed. It's like, officer, officer, officer. I didn't think that you would catch me doing this.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair. It's like, well, you still shouldn't have done that. Uh-oh.
Yeah, it didn't quite pan out that way. And so I think one of them is one of the guys identified thus far is a guy named Hong Chang. And he's an established human rights activist, so he's apparently pretty well known. So this isn't necessarily coming out of nowhere. This group has operated before, but apparently I don't know that they've ever done something like this, at least nothing that we know about. And again, it may be that they're working with the CIA, another intelligence agency, or maybe they're just working on their own. One of the theories in that vein is that they were trying to look for info on Kim Hyok-chol. Again, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation. Kim Hyok-chol is basically a former North Korean ambassador to Spain, but more importantly, he's the current head of the North Korean negotiating team in nuclear negotiations with the United States. So it may be that this group wanted to find information on him of some kind and turn that over to the U.S. so that they could use it in the negotiation. Obviously, that suggests a potential U.S. connection at least. Obviously, the U.S. would be interested in such information. But it's not clear that the U.S. is directly behind it. I would imagine I'm skeptical the U.S. is involved because I would imagine that they would have more subtle ways of doing that than just launching a movie-style raid on an embassy. But I could easily be wrong, who's to say? And again, their plan was originally don't get caught. Although going to the media and giving a rationalization kind of makes me doubt that. That's not really a subtle move if you're a clandestine underground organization. But that's an interesting... Sorry, go ahead.
Not as underground as we thought.
Yeah, exactly. But that's an interesting event that's happened over the past couple weeks, and it hasn't played out entirely yet. Because obviously North Korea is not going to be happy about having their embassy attacked like that. So who they blame for that and what they do about that is kind of in the air. And one of the fears, certainly amongst this organization, is that the North Korean government might retaliate by targeting them and maybe even killing their members. So you might be hearing about that in the news at some time in the next couple months. It might be that there's some North Korean assassinations of some people in the next couple months, which could have corresponding diplomatic fallout depending on how they do that. That could be a thing to watch for. But overall, just a very strange, bizarre story. It really kind of like something from a movie, kind of like what you said.
Better than a Netflix original.
Exactly.
Next time at the North Korean embassy in Spain.
One clandestine organization, formerly below ground, now above ground, talks to the news. Guys, it was an accident.
So it goes.
Well, sweet.
Well, logical stopping point for you?
Yeah, this is good.
Gotcha.
Well, sweet. So we did 1943, correct? So we got 44 next?
Yep, 44 next time.
Nice. So I can actually, I think, put this in the description or the title, which is useful for me to let people know what they're signing up for. We did have a few people who were like, this is awesome. Where do I find the previous episode so I can get caught up? This was 1943. I was not alive at that time. This is all new to me. Well, aside from what we talked about before.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, somebody in chat, I think last time, pointed out that apparently, just my good luck, Carlin, the history podcaster, he apparently released in the past couple months a whole thing on the Pacific Theater. Like 8 hours of stuff or something.
Nice.
So if you're interested in this topic, I guess, give him a try. He's pretty well regarded. I don't think he's like an official historian, but he does pretty good work. He's one of the more popular history podcasters. So I imagine he has a lot more detail than I do. I'm not even remotely at his level. So definitely give that a look if you're interested in more.
Well, if I can cheer for you a little bit, I have noticed that it seems like you've improved at speaking to my audience. I've noticed your word choice. Sometimes you use some StarCraft terminology and some hooks, especially talking about strategy in a lot of these Pacific Theater things.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And you said something about the host before. It's like, yep, he's getting good at this. You better be careful. Agent Smith, when you get really big, don't forget about us, okay?
I don't think I'm in much danger of that, but if it should come to pass, I'll make sure to throw you a line.
Okay. It'll mean the world to me.
No, but really, I do appreciate the opportunity. It's a lot of fun for me to be on here like this. So all the feedback is appreciated. Listeners appreciated. Yeah, good time. Awesome stuff.
Well, sweet action. We should be pretty much good to go next week, the week after. The only thing that kind of registers for me on a scheduling level is my bank account will have suddenly less money in about 2 weeks. But that doesn't really affect us. No, it's taxes time.
Oh, shit, that's right.
Yeah.
I should probably do those.
Yeah, that would be good. I did mine, in February? So it's squared away. It's one of those, I know how much is going to be subtracted. I have more than that. I don't want to feel it happen, but I know it's going to happen, so we're just going to brace ourselves and move on. It's fine.
Yeah, I'm going to have to navigate tax forms for the first time. Normally, I just do like the easy form because I don't make any money. I haven't for a long time. But I guess since I'm technically like an independent contractor, I guess I have to do a different form this time. I think that's what I was looking at earlier.
You are. I don't know if you earned enough from your PayPal specifically. I know that there's a threshold where PayPal is legally obligated to send you a form. And that will end up being the easiest. Like if that's your main spot where you get revenue, you can just basically plug all that stuff. And I use TurboTax. It's just an online website. They walk you through every step. It's pretty easy.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll be looking into that. I don't think I've gotten anything from them yet, but maybe it's in the mail. That's how it used to work when I was working as an RA.
Oh, I just log into my PayPal to get all that. I don't rely on the mail.
Shit, I should do that then.
Yeah. I think
the university was always super slow. They would send you your W2 like a month or two before the tax due date.
Yeah.
Go figure.
Well, awesome having you on, as usual.
Yep, thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
The audience is just going to be physically shaking until we find out more about what's happening in the Pacific Theater.
Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
Yep. Goku goes to the next blonde hair level. No way, dude. Yes way. And thank you, Neuro, for handing along questions to Agent Smith.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I know that's actually that's cognitively difficult to balance that with the gaming and what. So particularly laudits go to Neuro for handling that today.
If I can vent a little bit, I got really bad luck with my opponents as well, because I normally queue on Europe server during this, and my rating is a little bit lower to give myself more room to listen to you and try to keep up with what's going on. And I just kept getting EU Grandmasters, so like above my normal rating. I'm queuing into harder opponents than I would have otherwise, and it's like, yep, I'm trying to focus here, and there's someone who's just totally destroying me, and it's like, well, this is my life now. Agent Smith is doing well, so I'm just the sacrificial lamb.
Well, we all appreciate it.
Yep. It's a fun challenge doing this kind of work. It's a new frontier. But yeah, appreciate your time, Mr. Agent Smith.
Yep, I'll see you next time.
Yep, until the next one. GG.